Welcome back to Historical Sleep, the storyteller for your sleep partner that digs up the history beneath our feet. If you love stories about small towns with big secrets, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode and can follow Ilara's journey in real time. Please subscribe and tell us about you. Where are you from listening this story? The first time Emma Collins heard the forest breathe, she was 9 years old, standing barefoot on the cool moss that blanketed her grandparents' land in western Oregon. It was long after dusk, and the towering Douglas firs loomed above her like cathedral columns. She had wandered out of the old cabin because sleep had been impossible. Every creak of the rafters sounded like a whispered secret, and every hoot of an owl tugged her curiosity toward the trees. Her grandmother, before drifting off to bed, had told her, "These woods hold memories older than any story. If you listen closely, you can hear them murmur to each other." At the time, Emma thought she meant the wind, but as she stood under the skeletal branches of the firs and inhaled their resin-sweet breath, she understood that the old woman's words were not metaphor. The forest felt alive. She sensed its gentle rumble beneath her feet, like a giant exhaling a long, weary sigh. That night, she whispered back. Emma had not returned to that forest for nearly 20 years. Life had carried her across the country like a leaf in a storm. College in Boston, a job in Chicago, deadlines, spreadsheets, and everything that squeezed out time for wonder. Her grandparents were long gone now, and the land had passed to her mother, who kept it untouched but rarely visited. But the day Emma lost her job, laid off in a blur of polite corporate apologies, something tugged at her memory. The whispering woods, the feeling of home that she hadn't realized she was missing. She packed her car with what little she owned, cleared her calendar, which was easier than she had expected, and began the 2-day drive west. The highways thinned into rural roads, which dissolved eventually into a gravel track. When the forest finally rose up around her, it felt like stepping back into an unfinished dream. The cabin was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown. Ivy wrapped its porch posts like a gentle embrace. The air smelled of cedar, loam, and the faintest trace of smoke from wildfires miles away. The Pacific Northwest evening light filtered through the canopy in fractured gold. As she stepped out of the car, a hush settled over her. The quiet was not empty. It was layered, rustling, shifting, pulsing, alive. "Hello," she whispered, before she even realized she had spoken. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead in response. It felt like a welcome. Over the next several days, Emma let herself settle in. She swept dust from the floors, reopened stuck windows, and repaired the porch steps with leftover planks her grandfather had once cut. The work soothed her hands and her heart. But most of all, she walked the forest. The old-growth, giant firs towered above her, some older than the founding of the country. Their bark was deeply furrowed, each groove a century of time. Salmon berries bloomed along the understory, birds flitted between branches, and the occasional deer watched her with curious stillness. One afternoon, as she sat with her back against a massive cedar, she felt a rhythmic vibration beneath her spine. Not seismic, something softer, like a heartbeat buried deep in the earth. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell. "Forests are families, Emma. The roots talk to each other. They share water, share warnings, even comfort one another. They remember." Back then, Emma had pictured the roots as old storytellers gathered around a fire. Now, decades later, she realized the old woman had been speaking about something real, something science was only beginning to prove. Mycorrhizal networks, fungal pathways, shared nutrients, electrical impulses moving in slow symphonies underground. But sitting against that cedar, Emma felt more than science. She felt presence. When the cedar creaked softly in the breeze, it sounded like a voice. Are you talking to me?" she murmured. Another soft groan, a flutter of wind. Not an answer, but not an answer. She smiled, something she hadn't done much of in the past year. Several days later, while gathering kindling along a forgotten trail, Emma spotted movement ahead. A man stepped out from between the trees. Tall, bearded, with a faded ranger's jacket. His hair was more salt than pepper, and his eyes were the gray blue of storm clouds. She sterned. The woods were empty. Hadn't her mother said so? He raised a hand in greeting. "Didn't mean to startle you. Are you a ranger?" "Was. Retired now. Name's Callum Hayes." "Emma Collins," she said cautiously. "My family owns the cabin down the ridge. I knew your grandparents. Good people." A warmth spread through her chest. "You're the first person I've seen out here. Most folks stay clear of old growth. These forests have a way of demanding respect." He studied her for a moment, then added softly, "They also remember those who belong to them." Emma blinked. "What do you mean?" But Callum only smiled, nodded, and headed down the trail as quietly as he had appeared. That night, the forest woke her. A sound, not loud, but insistent, like the low hum of a distant choir. She sat up in the small loft of the cabin and listened. The hum grew stronger. Emma slipped on her boots and stepped outside into the moonlit clearing. The sky was cloudless, the stars sharp and cold. The air held a strange stillness. Then she felt it, a tremor underfoot. No, not a tremor, a pulse. The forest pulsed beneath her like a living lung, exhaling ancient breath. The trees seemed to lean gently toward one another. Branches whispered. Moss trembled like a creature stirring from slumber. Emma moved toward the center of the clearing, heart pounding. She knelt and placed her palms on the soil. Warmth greeted her. Not the warmth of the day lingering in the ground. This was different. Alive. Intentional. "Hello?" she whispered, voice shaking. The ground vibrated in response. Memories flashed through her mind. Her grandparents at the kitchen table, her grandmother's stories, her childhood nights wandering between ferns. A sense of belonging flooded her, so strong it nearly broke her into tears. But beneath her palms, the earth whispered something deeper. A warning. The pulse shifted. Faster. More urgent. The trees rustled though no wind moved. Emma stood abruptly. Something was coming. The next morning, Callum returned. His expression was grim. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked without preamble. Emma didn't bother pretending otherwise. "Yes." He exhaled, shoulders sagging. "There's a wildfire burning 60 miles east. Most folks don't know yet. These old forests, they feel it coming before we do." Emma's stomach tightened. "Should I evacuate?" "Not yet," Callum said. "Wind's in our favor for now, but the forest is nervous. You probably sense that." She nodded. The memory of the forest's pulse still lingered in her bones. Callum studied her with a strange intensity. "Your grandmother, she understood things most people ignore. This forest trusted her. It remembers her." "And it remembers me?" she whispered. "Yes," he said simply. That evening, Emma walked deeper into the woods than ever before. The canopy thickened overhead, filtering the sunset into a mosaic of amber. She followed the narrow footpath that her grandfather once used for foraging. Soon she reached a clearing she had no memory of. At its center stood the oldest tree she had ever seen, an enormous cedar, its trunk wide as a truck, its branches sweeping the sky. The bark was scarred with time, but magnificent. She approached it slowly, reverently. The moment her palm touched the bark, warmth surged through her fingers. And then she heard voices. Not literal voices, more like impressions, faint, overlapping whispers woven through the tree's pulse. A woman's laughter, boots crunching snow, her grandmother's stories, her childhood nights wandering between ferns. A sense of belonging flooded her, so strong it nearly broke her into tears. But beneath her palms, the earth whispered something deeper. A warning. The pulse shifted, faster, more urgent. The trees rustled, though no wind moved. Emma stood abruptly. Something was coming. The wildfire arrived 3 days later, not in a raging inferno, but as an orange glow on the horizon, like a second sunset that refused to fade. The air thickened with a scent of burning pine. Ash drifted like black snowflakes. Callum arrived at dawn with a truckload of supplies. Evacuation orders just went out, but we've got time to prepare the land. Help me clear a fire break. Emma nodded. They worked in the hot, smoky air, chopping low branches, clearing brush, wetting the cabin's roof. "Why help me?" she asked at one point, panting. Callum paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because this forest means something to you, and because you, like your grandmother, hear it. Folks like you are rare." She met his gaze, surprised by the softness in his voice. "I don't know what the forest wants from me," she said quietly. "Sometimes it doesn't want anything," Callum replied. "Just someone who listens." That evening, as the fire drew closer, Emma sat on the porch, watching ember glow flicker through the distant treetops. The forest was utterly still. Even the animals had gone quiet. Callum slept inside, exhausted. Emma rose and walked barefoot into the clearing. Something compelled her, an unspoken call. She approached the giant cedar she had visited days before. "I'm here. I'm listening." The ground trembled, not with fear, but with recognition. Roots swelled beneath the soil like rising chords in a symphony. Leaves rustled in slow, sweeping waves. The forest wasn't panicking. It was steadying itself. Suddenly, she understood. The forest had survived 1,000 fires, 1,000 storms, 1,000 years. Its roots remembered every scar, every regrowth. It wasn't begging to be saved. It was reminding her to endure. Emma placed both hands on the cedar. "Okay," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I won't leave you." The next morning, sirens echoed faintly from the valley. Callum stood beside Emma, his face tight with worry. The fire had jumped the containment line. Then, almost miraculously, the wind shifted. Not a small breeze, a full, hard turn, pushing the fire eastward. The sky cleared slightly. The smoke thinned. Callum exhaled in disbelief. "I've seen fire behavior for 30 years. I've never seen a shift that sharp without a storm." Emma looked up at the cedar trees swaying. "They knew it," she whispered. Callum didn't argue. The fire receded over the next 24 hours, moving away from the old-growth grove. Firefighters gained control. Ash fell like the dust of burned nurseries, but the green canopy remained standing. When it was over, Emma walked the forest again. Some undergrowth was singed, but the giants still stood tall. Their roots, deep as time, had held. She approached the ancient cedar once more, its bark, warm beneath the sun, pulsed gently. "Thank you," she whispered. The whisper that returned was soft, almost inaudible, but she heard it. Emma never returned to her corporate life. Instead, she stayed. She rebuilt the cabin, restored the land, and began writing about the forest, its stories, its science, its whispers. Her work spread across the country, inspiring readers to look at America's ancient lands with renewed reverence. Callum visited often. Sometimes they walked together, saying little. Silence was, after all, the forest's first language. And every night, as the trees rustled under a sky spilling with stars, Emma listened to the quiet pulse beneath her feet. The forest breathed, and she breathed with it. Because the roots, older than memory, had accepted her, not as a visitor, but as a keeper of their whispers. Long before the continent was carved into states, long before the first European explorer ever set foot on its shores, the great sequoia, known as Madu, stood in silence at the edge of a valley. It was not yet called California. It was simply the land of many suns. Madu was already 200 years old by then, though merely an infant compared to what he would become. Birds nested in his branches. Wolves brushed past his trunk. The early ancestors of native nations walked beneath his boughs, offering quiet greetings to the towering presence that anchored the world around them. Madu listened. He always had. Trees did not speak in words, but in a rhythm older than language. The slow pulse of sap, the long breath of seasons, the whisper of roots touching roots in the dark soil beneath. Through that network, he felt the stories of the land, the glaciers retreating, the grasslands stretching wide, the rivers carving their serpentine paths. But one story would come to define him above all, the story of humans. The first humans who passed beneath Madu's shadow were wanderers, families moving with the seasons, following herds of elk and patterns of ripe berries. They did not take more than they needed. The forest respected them for that. One autumn, a group of Chumash ancestors settled near the base of the valley. Among them was a girl named Sina, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. She was small and quick, with a laugh that seemed to rise like sunlight through the branches. Sina had a habit of placing her ear against Madu's bark and closing her eyes. "What are you doing?" her older brother teased one day. "Listening," she said. "To what?" She opened her eyes. "He's thinking." Her brother laughed and ran off, but the tree felt a quiet thrill ripple through his rings. For generations, the tribe returned to the valley, teaching their children the songs of the oak groves, the uses of herbs, the movement of stars. Sina grew old, and her grandchildren continued her rituals. Madu watched their ceremonies, their dances, their stories drawn in the dirt. He learned their reverence for the land, how they treated each tree as a relative, not a resource. When winter storms came, the tribe leaned into the forest for shelter. When spring arrived, they celebrated with new fires and thanks. The exchange was mutual. Humans kept the land healthy, the land sustained their lives. It was a balance as old as the dawn. Centuries passed. Madu grew wider, taller, stronger. His trunk thickened, his branches stretched higher than thunderclouds, his roots sank deep into the bedrock. He became the great father of the valley, respected, ancient, formidable. But one summer, the wind carried unfamiliar scents: iron, salt, and something sharp, like fear. The first outsiders came quietly, explorers moving along the coast. They did not speak the native languages, nor did they understand the land's rhythms. They cut paths where none belonged. They carried diseases that spread faster than wildfires. Forests felt the imbalance immediately. Madhu sensed it first in the soil. The roots whispered warnings, changes, dangers, pain. Soon, native families who had lived in the valley for countless seasons began disappearing. Some succumbing to illness, others forced away by strangers seeking gold, fur, or land they believed could be claimed simply because they walked across it. For the first time in his centuries of life, Madhu felt helpless. Trees could endure fire, drought, storms, even axes, but they could not stop the vanishing of people whose songs had nourished the forest for generations. Madhu remembered Sina's laugh, her descendants' rituals, the care they had given to the valley. Without them, something sacred dimmed. Still, he stood watch. It was all a tree could do. In the mid-1800s, surveyors arrived. They hammered metal stakes into the soil, dragged chains across meadows, and scribbled lines onto maps. The land was divided into parcels, numbered and packaged like goods in a market. Madhu felt each intrusion like a bruise. One morning, a man rested his back against Madhu's trunk and unfolded a large sheet of paper. "This will be County 17. The lumberfolk will love this region." Lumber. The word sent shockwaves through the root network. That night, the forest held a council, a murmur of leaves and roots, a gathering of wisdom older than any kingdom. The pines whispered fear, the oaks whispered resistance, the firs whispered questions. Madhu remained silent until the moon rose. "We will endure," he communicated through the roots, "as we always have." But deep down, he knew the world was changing faster than trees could adapt. The next decades proved him right. Hundreds of giants fell to axes and saws. The sound of timber cracking became the forest's daily grief. Railroads crawled through canyons, new towns rose, highways scratched across valleys that once echoed with birdsong. And yet, somehow, Madhu survived.
His remote valley was difficult to access, and early settlers found the soil too rocky to farm. Lumbermen marked him but never returned for him. Maybe they forgot, maybe fate intervened, or maybe the forest protected its elder. Whatever the reason, Madhu remained. He watched the world reshape itself. One spring afternoon in the 1930s, after nearly a century with no familiar footsteps, a young native boy wandered into the valley with his grandmother. Their tribe had been displaced long ago, but the old woman remembered stories passed down from Sena's line. She approached Madhu with slow reverence. "This is the one," she whispered to her grandson, "the old father." She placed her palm against the bark, just as Sena once had, and began to hum a melody older than memory. Her voice shook with age, but the tune carried strength. Madhu recognized it instantly. It was Sena's childhood song. The tree shivered from roots to crown. A wave of warmth pulsed through the network underground, awakening memories buried beneath centuries of sorrow. The grandmother closed her eyes. "You remember," she said softly, "and because you remember, so do we." Her grandson mimicked her, resting his cheek against the bark. "Does he talk?" he asked. "Not like we do, but if you listen long enough, he'll teach you to hear more than sound." For the first time in generations, Madhu felt seen, not as lumber, not as a landmark on a map, but as a witness of time. The boy returned many times over the years, bringing friends, then children, then grandchildren of his own. He told them stories his grandmother taught him, stories that kept the valley alive in human memory. And slowly people from nearby towns learned to value the old forest. They began petitioning for its protection. It took decades, but eventually the valley became a protected reserve. Through the 20th century, the world beyond the valley grew louder. Cars, radios, televisions, satellites. Borders hardened. Politics changed. Wars were fought. The idea of America grew more complex with each passing generation. But none of that changed Medu's truth. He had lived on this land before it had a name, before tribes built villages, before explorers arrived, before settlers divided the soil into squares, before highways traced scars across the wilderness. Medu did not care what people called the land. He cared how they treated it. The forest around him slowly healed. Animals returned. Campsites moved farther from the fragile groves. Researchers came to study him. Botanists, conservationists, ecologists. They measured his height, studied his bark, collected soil samples around his roots. But the ones he loved most were the children. Children still placed their ears against his trunk, listening for the pulse. Children still tried to wrap their arms around him, never succeeding, but always laughing at the attempt. Children, unburdened by the weight of ownership, seemed to understand instinctively what adults often forgot. The land belonged to itself, and humans were guests. Among many who came to know the valley, one girl stood out. Lily Davis, an 11-year-old whose family had moved to a nearby town after her father lost his job in the city. Lily felt lonely, uprooted, and resentful, until her teacher announced a field trip to the reserve. When Lily first saw Medu, she stopped breathing for a moment. He towered impossibly high, a skyscraper made of bark. Sunlight poured around him in golden shafts. The air felt cooler near him, calmer, almost sacred. Her classmates ran past, shouting and pointing, but Lily approached quietly. She touched his trunk. A warmth hummed beneath her fingers. Not heat, life. Lily pressed her ear to the bark. She heard wind swaying through branches, the faint scratch of insects deep inside the wood, the soft thrum of her own heartbeat amplified. But beneath that, beneath everything, she heard something else. A pulse. Slow, steady, ancient. It sounded like a memory waking up. Lily returned every weekend. She sketched Medu in her notebook, wrote stories about him, and asked her parents endless questions. Why hasn't he fallen? How old is he? Do trees feel lonely? What did he see before buildings existed? Her parents didn't know the answers, but Medu did. He watched her with the patience of centuries, sensing in her the same curiosity Senna once carried. She sank to the forest floor, listening, learning, grounding herself in his presence. Lily found peace in the old tree, stability she didn't know she needed. And Medu found something he'd missed, the attention of a human who asked nothing of him except his history. Climate change brought fierce summers. Wildfires grew hotter, bigger, less predictable. The valley, though protected, was not immune. One August evening, lightning struck a ridge miles away. The fire spread with terrifying speed, racing through parched brush. Evacuation orders went out. Lily's family hurried to pack their truck, but Lily begged her father. "We have to check the reserve. The fire's heading that way." Her father hesitated, but she insisted, tears streaming down her face. They drove as close as officials allowed, but the smoke was thick and authorities blocked the road. Lily cried, silently, the entire night, imagining Medu swallowed by flames. But the forest had its own defenses. Medu had survived dozens of fires. His bark, thick as armor, resisted heat. The forest floor around him had been cleared and maintained through generations of careful stewardship.
The fire reached the valley, but it did not consume it. Instead, it circled around like a river around a boulder. Firefighters, aided by a sudden shift in wind, redirected the flames away from the ancient grove. When the smoke cleared, Madhu still stood. Some branches were scorched, the ground was blackened in patches, but he was alive. Lily returned as soon as the reserve reopened. She ran to Madhu and touched his bark. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. A breeze rustled through his crown. A gentle rain of needles drifted around her. And in her chest, something settled. A feeling that the forest had chosen to stay. Years passed. Lily grew. She went to college, studied environmental science, and began writing about forests, how they connect, communicate, heal, and record time. Every visit home included a pilgrimage to Madhu. One summer afternoon, now a young woman, she stood before him with a hiking pack slung over her shoulder. "I'm leaving soon," she said, running her hand along the bark, "but I'll come back, I promise." And she meant it. Lily would go on to work in conservation, shaping policies that protected ancient forests across the United States. She traveled, studied, advocated, but always returned to the valley, the place that taught her how to listen. She eventually became one of the country's strongest voices for preserving old-growth ecosystems, and every speech she gave, every article she wrote, began with the same idea. Before America had a name, there were trees. They witnessed everything, and they still do. Our job is to honor what they remember. Madhu stands still today, tall, patient, watching. He has lived through the rise and fall of tribes, empires, nations, and ideas. He has witnessed migrations of animals and migrations of people. He has felt the tremble of earthquakes, the frost of centuries, the heat of wildfires, the gentle touch of human palms, and the whispers of children dreaming beneath his branches. He does not care what the land is called. He cares how it is treated. And he remembers everything. The footsteps of ancient peoples, the songs carried by the wind, the laughter of children who believed trees could think, the grief of lands scarred by greed, the hope carried by those who returned to protect what remained. Before America had a name, there were stories rooted in the soil. And as long as trees like Madhu stand, those stories will never disappear. In the northern reaches of what is now the United States, long before borders and state lines were drawn, there lay a vast forest so old that even the mountains bowed toward it. The people who lived beside this forest, the Kaskama, the river people, called it a Nepo, meaning the one who remembers. To them, a Nepo was not scenery, it was not land to be managed or conquered. A Nepo was a living archive, its trees rooted deep in memory. Every branch was a relative, every fallen leaf a message carried from the past. On quiet mornings, the forest hummed gently, as if telling stories in a language only patience could translate, and the river people listened. The girl's name was Taya, a child with sky-dark hair and eyes that held a kind of solemn wonder. She was 8, the first time she felt the forest breathe. Her grandmother, Elder Ruksa, was guiding her through the early spring understory, teaching her to identify plants awakening from winter. "Listen," she whispered, placing her hand against the bark of a towering hemlock. Taya pressed her palm beside her grandmother's. At first, nothing, only silence. Then, as the wind shifted, she felt it, a faint vibration, like the tree was exhaling through the soil. Taya startled. "It's alive!" Ruxa smiled. "Of course. Not only alive, a witness. A witness to what?" "To everything the land remembers," her grandmother said softly. "These trees have watched generations come and go. They have seen storms, celebrations, births, losses. They carry our people's stories deeper than we ever could." From that moment on, Taya visited the hemlock every morning, listening for secrets carried along the ridges of its bark. It didn't speak with words, but she felt its presence, steady, patient, ancient. Every year at the summer solstice, The Kaskama gathered beneath Hawegi, the grand cedar. It stood on a ridge overlooking the river, its branches spreading like a great sheltering wing. Hawegi was believed to hold the memories of thousands of seasons. On this particular solstice, Taya walked with her family up the gentle rise toward the grand cedar. As they approached, elders stood in a circle around Hawegi, each carrying bundles of sage and cedar boughs. Taya felt the air shift. It always did near Hawegi. The wind softened, the world quieted. The eldest storyteller, Kima, raised her voice. We gather to thank Enepo for holding our stories, for keeping us in its memory, for giving us breath, shade, and guidance. Taya sat cross-legged at the base of the cedar, resting her back against the warm bark. She closed her eyes, and something extraordinary happened. She felt a pulse, slow, strong, almost like a drumbeat beneath her palm. Her breath caught. Taya, Hawegi? It wasn't a voice she heard exactly, more like a presence acknowledging her. A wave of warmth spread through her chest. Maybe, she thought, the forest remembers me too.
As Taya grew older, Elder Ruxa began teaching her more of the old ways. She learned how to walk softly on leaf-littered trails so she wouldn't disturb nesting birds. She learned how to gather willow bark in a way that didn't harm the tree. She learned how to offer thanks each time she used anything from the forest: berries, wood, water, even a handful of soil. Everything you take remembers you, her grandmother said, so give back your gratitude. One afternoon, while tracing deer tracks near a grove of ancient pines, Taya asked, "Grandmother, do the trees ever forget?" Rux's eyes softened. The younger ones forget, the way young people forget. But the elders, she touched a pine whose bark was thick and grooved like old skin. They remember everything. Taya smiled. Even me? Especially you. One autumn afternoon, as crimson leaves drifted onto the riverbank, Taya spotted someone she didn't recognize. A stranger, young, perhaps in his 20s, stood staring at the forest with a troubled expression. He wore clothing unlike the woven garments of the Kastma. His boots were heavy, his jacket rough. His skin was pale, his features unfamiliar. Taya approached cautiously. He didn't notice her until she spoke. "Are you lost?" He turned abruptly, startled. Yes. I came with a group, but we got separated." Taya studied him. He seemed frightened, but not dangerous. "Follow me," she said, motioning toward a trail. "I'll guide you to the open plains. Your people might be there." As they walked, the stranger kept glancing nervously at the trees. "What is this place?" he asked. "Enepo," Taya replied, "the forest that remembers." He frowned. "A forest can't remember." Taya smiled softly. "That is what you think." At a clearing, she halted and placed her hand against a towering maple. "This tree has lived for 300 summers. It saw my ancestors create their first bow. It watched the river shift its path. It has listened to our songs for generations." "It's just a tree," the man muttered. Taya shook her head. "No, you just haven't learned to hear." Years passed. Taya became a young woman, known not only for her deep connection to the forest, but also for her fierce devotion to learning every story Enepo held. But one year, the hottest Taya had ever known, the sky turned orange. Lightning struck the southern ridge after weeks of drought. Fire exploded through the underbrush, racing upward through dry branches. The river people gathered at Hawagi in fear. Smoke rolled across the valley. Ash floated like black snow. The wind howled. Taya's heart pounded. "The fire will reach the grand cedar," she cried. Elders shook their heads. "We cannot fight flames this large."
But Taya refused to stand helpless. With a soaked blanket over her shoulders, she ran toward Hawagi as embers spiraled through the air. "Hawagi, hold on!" she shouted. The wind shifted. A swirl of cool air descended from the ridge. The fire slowed, hesitated. As Taya approached the ancient tree, she pressed her forehead against its bark. "You held our stories for so long," she whispered. "Let me hold yours now." She stayed there, shielding the cedar with her body, as villagers joined her with wet hides and buckets of river water. Hours passed. By dawn, the flames had moved eastward, sparing Hawagi and most of the ancient grove. The village said the shift in wind was a miracle. Taya knew better. Hawagi had called for help, and she had heard. After the fire, the Kustgma held a ceremony to thank the forest for its resilience. Children decorated cedar branches with beads, feathers, and river stones. Elders sang songs passed down through centuries. Taya led the procession to Hawagi, placing her hands against the bark. "You are still here," she whispered. A warm pulse radiated beneath her touch. The trees of Enepo had survived storms, droughts, migrations, and now fire. They carried the memories of every generation that lived beside them. They were guardians of a time before the world became divided into nations. During the ceremony, Kima the storyteller beckoned Taya forward. "You have listened well," the elder said. "You have honored the voices of our forest relatives. Now you must carry their stories to the ones who will come after us." Taya bowed her head. "I will." And she did. She taught children how to greet each tree as a relative. She taught them which berries were safe, how to give thanks for fallen branches before using them, how to honor the wind that carried distant voices. The first people believed stories should pass through generations without leaving scars, and Taya made sure of it. Eventually, strangers from distant lands began approaching the forest more often. Taya was cautious but curious. Some sought trade, some sought guidance, others only passed through. Many did not understand the forest's sanctity. They took wood without asking, cut paths without care, left scars without knowing they harmed a relative. Taya confronted them when needed, but always peacefully. "This forest is a living archive," she said. "Its memories are older than your maps. Treat each tree with respect." Some listened, others did not. But Taya continued teaching, planting seeds of understanding even where she feared roots would not take hold. As Taya grew older, she felt Enepo's stories pulsing through her body, like a second heartbeat. She could sense when storms approached days before clouds gathered. She could predict where animals would migrate by listening to the soil. She could hear sadness in dying branches and joy in new growth. One crisp autumn morning, she returned to Hawagi, now weathered by decades of seasons. She sat at its base, leaning against its familiar trunk. "I am old," she whispered, "but you are older." The cedar responded with a gentle groan, like a sigh through centuries. "If you remember me, remember also the children to come. Teach them as you taught me." She placed her palm on the bark. "I give you my story," she said softly. The forest accepted it. A warmth spread through the ground, deep, steady, eternal. The roots carried her final gift into the soil, sharing it with pines, hemlocks, firs, and the saplings rising toward the sun. And so when Taya passed into the next world, the children said, "Hawaii sings louder now," because the cedar held her story. Centuries later, long after nations rose and borders hardened, the forest still stands.
Visitors, hikers, scientists, families, wander beneath towering branches. Many pause at the great cedar on the ridge, sensing something they can't explain. A warmth, a presence, a memory. Some place their hands against the bark and whisper, "What do you remember?" The cedar answers, not in words, but in a slow pulse felt through the fingertips. It remembers Taya. It remembers the river people. It remembers the songs that once echoed without leaving scars. It remembers the reverence of those who walked gently on the earth. It remembers a time before the land was divided. The voices of the first people remain woven through the forest like threads of golden light. Their respect endures in every branch, every fallen leaf, every seed carried on the wind. Anepo, the one who remembers, still listens. And if you listen long enough, it will speak to you, too. A gentle recounting of early settlers encountering vast, untouched wilderness. They first saw the tree line from a distance, a dark, unbroken ribbon stretching across the horizon like the edge of an old world waiting to be reawakened. The sea had carried them for months, rocking them awake under the cold breath of the Atlantic, but nothing prepared them for the sheer silence that greeted them when the land finally came into view. It was not the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of something so full, so alive, that sound itself felt unnecessary. As their small boat scraped against the unfamiliar shore, the settlers, men, women, and a handful of restless children, paused to absorb the sight before them. There were no roads, no fences, no cabins, no fields cleared for crops. The wilderness lay as it had for countless ages, patient and unhurried, towering over them in deep greens, soft golds, and shadows thick enough to feel like a curtain drawn over a stage. The trees closest to the water leaned in as if to listen, their branches heavy with late summer leaves that rustled in greeting. The newcomers could not understand the language of the forest, but if they had lingered just a moment longer in stillness, they might have heard a soft remembrance in that rustle, something like, "Ah, new footsteps, again." The forest had seen visitors before, ancient ones who moved with reverence, and others who walked lightly, barely leaving a mark. But these footsteps were different. These newcomers carried hopes and fears in equal weight, hopes as bright as dawn, and fears as dark as the shadowed canopy. They carried notebooks filled with dreams of farms and villages, churches and schools, but also the uncertainty that comes with stepping into a world that does not yet know your name. The forest that watched. Deep in the woods, a white pine that had lived for nearly 3 centuries stirred in the faint breeze. Its needles whispered softly, sending a message through the canopy to the maples, the beeches, the hemlocks, and the towering chestnuts that had stood long before any ship crossed the ocean. "New hearts have come," the pine murmured. A sugar maple nearby, its leaves dappled in gold from the slanting afternoon sun, responded with an easy rustle. "We have seen footsteps before. The land holds enough space for all who respect its breath." But the oak, a broad, older tree, whose roots twisted so deeply into the earth they touched memories long forgotten by anything with a heartbeat, felt a shift that was both familiar and strange. Yes, but these footsteps carry tools that bite. The forest did not react with fear. Ancient things rarely do. Instead, they observed, they listened, they welcomed with caution the way an old storyteller welcomes a new generation of listeners. The settlers, unaware of this quiet conversation, began unloading their belongings. Rough blankets, sacks of grain, iron pots, old journals tucked beside well-used pewter cups. They set these possessions on the cool earth, pausing as the unfamiliar cries of distant birds rang through the treetops. The forest responded to their arrival with a chorus that had echoed for thousands of years. Warblers trilling in the understory, ravens croaking from the highest branches, cicadas humming like hidden engines in the grass. It felt overwhelming, but also strangely comforting. For the first time in months, the newcomers could smell soil instead of salt water, hear leaves instead of waves, and feel the embrace of something vast, yet gentle. Journals in salt-stained hands. Later that evening, as the sun melted into the ocean behind them, one of the settlers, a young woman named Eleanor Finch, sat against the trunk of a massive hemlock and opened the journal she had protected throughout the long voyage. Her handwriting wobbled slightly with exhaustion as she recorded, "Today, we arrived at a land that stands untouched, as if it has been waiting silently for us. The trees are older than any I have known. They seem to watch us kindly, though perhaps we are trespassers on a world far wiser than our own." Her words were simple but honest, filled with awe. She noticed the way the roots curl like ancient arms around mossy stones, how the canopy above gathered the last light of the day like a quilt of emerald flame. She noticed too how the deeper they walked inland, the quieter their companions became, humbled by the immensity of what stood before them. The forest sensed her gentleness. The hemlock she leaned upon seemed to exhale, releasing a faint breeze scented with resin and cool earth. In that moment, the connection between human and wilderness, the one that had existed long before nations, long before borders, glowed softly again, like an ember reignited.
Footsteps into the unknown. The next morning, the settlers ventured deeper into the forest to explore the land that might someday cradle their future homes. They walked slowly, partly from caution, partly from admiration. Towering white oaks rose around them like pillars in a cathedral older than memory. Ferns brushed their ankles softly, curling in delicate spirals along the forest floor. Mushrooms glowed faintly under fallen logs, and clear streams whispered secrets from beneath beds of rounded stones. Some settlers, like Eleanor, were captivated by the beauty. Others felt intimidated, overwhelmed by a world so far beyond anything they had known. A few reached instinctively for the hatchets strapped to their belts, not in aggression, but in preparedness. The wilderness seemed endless, and they feared being swallowed by it. At the same time, the forest observed their every motion. A red fox watched from behind a cluster of birches, its amber eyes gleaming with curiosity. A pair of deer lifted their heads as the newcomers passed, ears flicking at the soft crunch of boots on leaves. A black bear, hidden well within the shadows of a ravine, simply sniffed the changing air and moved on, uninterested. The land acknowledged the presence of humans with a calm acceptance, recognizing them as another thread in a tapestry far older than any one species. Words written in new soil. Eleanor was not the only one who kept a journal. Thomas Granger, a carpenter with strong hands and a quiet disposition, recorded each observation meticulously. He wrote about the thickness of the trees, the quality of the soil, the fragrance of the air, but buried between these practical notes were sentences no practical man would admit aloud. There is a peace here that reminds me of childhood mornings when I would sit beneath my mother's apple tree and imagine the world as endless. Here, the world truly feels without end. These woods hold stories. I can feel it. If I listen closely, there is almost a humming. He didn't know that what he sensed was real. The hum of sap rising through trunks, the murmur of leaves brushing in conversation, the subtle shifting of ancient branches as they whispered memories to one another. Thomas felt something else too, an instinctual respect he couldn't quite explain. He hesitated each time his hand touched the handle of his axe, as if an unseen voice gently reminded him, "Do not cut thoughtlessly. These giants have been here far longer than you." Respect in the early days. For the first few weeks, the settlers took only what they needed. They gathered fallen branches for firewood instead of chopping live trees. They cleared small patches of brush, but left the enormous trunks untouched. They walked lightly, trying to learn the land before altering it. Some even believed the forest was watching them benevolently, and they treated it as a living entity rather than an obstacle. At night, gathered around modest fires, they shared stories inspired by the towering silhouettes that ringed their camp. Children imagined giants sleeping in the trunks of the pines. Older settlers claimed they could feel the spirits of the land in the shivering leaves. No one laughed at these ideas. In the presence of ancient forests, imagination was not foolish, it was natural. The forest in turn remained patient. It listened to their voices drift upward like smoke. It gently rocked the branches overhead as if to lull the newcomers into comfort. It welcomed their songs, their fears, and their tentative hope. Moments of learning. One afternoon, Eleanor wandered off the trail and found herself standing before a cedar whose trunk split into two perfect spirals as it rose. Sunlight filtered through its branches like liquid gold. She reached out and placed a hand on the bark. "I wish to understand you," she whispered. Though the cedar did not speak in words, it gifted her a feeling, a quiet sense of peace that settled deep within her chest, like a memory she had never lived but somehow knew. Another settler, a boy named Nathan, spent hours watching a pair of squirrels chase each other through the branches. He laughed each time they leapt impossibly far from one limb to another, and the squirrels seemed to pause mid-game to study him with equal fascination. Thomas, always the observer, knelt beside a fallen log one morning and discovered a world in miniature. Ants carrying seeds twice their size, beetles shining like bits of armor, moss glowing emerald bright in the shade. The realization humbled him. This land works harder in silence than most men do in noise, he murmured. The first clearing. Eventually, the settlers had no choice but to begin shaping a home. Winter loomed in the distance, and preparation was necessary. But the forest had become something of a companion, its presence steady and grounding, so when they finally raised their axes, they did so with hesitation. Thomas was the first to speak before the first tree was felled. "We take only what is needed, and we honor what we take." It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one. The settlers formed a quiet semicircle around a single straight oak. They bowed their heads, not as a ritual, but as an instinctive act of respect. Only then did the axes swing. The oak fell slowly, almost gracefully, as if acknowledging both the end of its journey and the beginning of theirs. The forest did not rage or recoil. It sighed, understanding that survival requires balance. The settlers worked through the day, clearing just enough space to build cabins that could shield them from coming storms. They left the majority of the old growth untouched, choosing to cluster their homes near the shore rather than deep within the woods. They believed, perhaps subconsciously, that the forest deserved its own space. A shared rhythm. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The settlers learned to read the forest, not through books, but through patient observation. They learned the sound of approaching rain in the whisper of distant branches. They learned which berries were safe by watching what the birds ate. They learned to follow deer trails to freshwater springs. And in return, the forest learned them. It memorized the sound of their morning footsteps, the way their campfires flickered at dusk, the way children's laughter bounced between trunks like wind-loosened leaves.
It came to recognize the settlers as part of its vast, breathing world, not intruders, but neighbors. Eleanor continued her journaling. Her entries grew increasingly poetic. This land is a teacher, and it does not rush its lessons. Today, the fog moved through the pines in great white waves, like the breath of a sleeping giant. I felt small in the best possible way. We take from the forest only what we can return in gratitude. The settlers' growing respect did not go unnoticed by the forest elders, the oak, the hemlock, the ancient pine. They spoke quietly among themselves through wind and root. These new footsteps are careful. They walk with intention. Perhaps this time the balance will hold. For a moment in history, a brief but beautiful one, humans and the ancient forests existed side by side in a quiet partnership. The first winter. When winter came, it draped the land in a thick quilt of snow. The settlers huddled in their cabins as howling winds rushed between trunks like unseen wolves. But the forest, even in its sternest season, protected them. It broke the wind with its evergreen branches. It offered fuel from fallen limbs. It provided insulation, shelter, and a sense of companionship that warmed hearts as much as fire warmed hands. During the coldest nights, Thomas would stand outside and listen to the creaking of tree limbs shifting under frost. To many, the sound might have been eerie, but to him, it felt like the groaning of an old house settling into comfort. Spring, a new beginning. When spring finally dawned, the settlers emerged to find the forest bursting with renewal. Brilliant green buds, sparkling streams freed from ice, and birdsong that filled the air like a jubilant orchestra. New life had returned, and so had balance. The settlers planted crops near the clearing, but left wide borders of wild growth untouched. They learned which herbs healed wounds, which bark brewed medicine, which fungi nourished the soil. They learned to coexist, not because a law demanded it, but because the land inspired it. Eleanor wrote, "We arrived strangers, but the land has made us part of its story." And the forest whispered back, through petals, through leaves, through the rising hum of spring. "You are footsteps among many, but you have walked gently, and for that we remember you." The lasting memory of arrival. Generations later, long after the original settlers had aged and passed on, their descendants still told stories about those early days. Stories of the first winter, of the first oak felled with respect, of the stillness of that first sunrise in a land untouched by their hands. Some of the oldest trees still stood, their bark scarred by time, but their crowns high and proud. They remembered Eleanor leaning against a hemlock. They remembered Thomas kneeling beside a fallen log. They remembered the children laughing at squirrels and the quiet promises whispered before the first tree was taken. These memories lived not only in the hearts of the forest, but in the soil itself, in the roots that stretched deeper than memory, in the canopy that held centuries of stories, in the wind that carried echoes of footsteps old and new. And though the world would change in ways unimaginable to those first settlers, the ancient forests never forgot the gentle arrival of those early footsteps, footsteps that for a moment in history walked softly enough to hear the trees breathe. How tree rings hold memories of storms, droughts, and seasons long gone. Long before scientists arrived with calipers and notebooks, before anyone coined the word dendrochronology, and long before the hum of saws filled the air, the ancient trees of America's forests had already been quietly recording the story of the continent. Each tree, whether a towering sequoia, a weather-scarred bristlecone pine, or a towering East Coast oak, kept its own diary carved in wood, hidden deep within its trunk. This diary did not speak in ink, but in circles. Every year, as spring awakened the land and summer warmed the soils, a tree would grow a new ring. Some years the ring was wide, telling of heavy rains and generous sunshine. Other years the ring was thin, sometimes barely visible to the naked eye, a sign of drought, frost, or hardship. And so for centuries, sometimes thousands of years, those rings spiraled inward like a labyrinth of memory, each line documenting the seasons that had come and gone. To most of the earliest inhabitants of the land, these rings were simply part of the natural order, a quiet truth left unspoken. But even without studying the rings directly, people understood that trees remembered. They had always believed it. And they were right. Deep in the heart of the old-growth forests, where oak, chestnut, and hemlock stood like pillars of an ancient cathedral, there lived a white oak known among the trees simply as Longkeeper. For nearly 600 years it had rooted itself into the earth, its trunk thicker than two settlers' wagons side by side, its crown so wide that birds nested in its branches without ever noticing the nests of their neighbors. Longkeeper was not special because of its age, though it was old indeed, but because of everything it carried inside. Its rings told the story of America long before the idea of America existed. In its earliest rings, light and wide, one could read the plentiful rains of the 1400s, when summers glowed warmly and streams overflowed with clear water. A few rings later, thin and dark, were signs of the great drought of the early 1500s, when the land cracked under relentless sun and the rivers shrank to tired trickles. It held in its wooden heart the memory of lightning storms that shook the soil, winter freezes that split lesser trees, gentle springs that brought flowers like spilled paint across the forest floor, and quiet years when nothing remarkable happened except the steady march of time. Longkeeper held them all, storm by storm, year by year, season by season. The other trees respected this. They often asked Longkeeper questions in the soft language of leaf rustle, because trees communicate in ways science has only begun to understand. When a young sapling shivered during its first winter frost, Longkeeper would whisper reassurance through the roots.
Centuries passed. Then one day, a group of humans, scientists, entered the forest carrying strange tools. They moved with an odd mixture of caution and excitement, unlike the settlers of old who had first walked these woods with awe and fear. These newcomers approached the trees not to chop them, but to listen. Dr. Miriam Hale, a dendrochronologist with silver-streaked hair and eyes that sparkled like ice-bright streams, led the group. She was a quiet woman who preferred forests to cities, who spoke to trees the way others spoke to old friends. "We aren't here to harm them," she reminded her students as they walked. "We're here to read what they've remembered." The students nodded, some still skeptical. They understood the trees had rings, of course. They'd learned the basics in school. But Dr. Hale insisted the rings held more than simple growth patterns. She insisted they held stories. When the team reached Longkeeper, Dr. Hale stopped. Her breath caught. She ran a gentle hand along its thick, furrowed bark. "This one," she whispered, "has seen everything." Her students exchanged glances, unsure how literally to take her words. But Longkeeper felt something it had not felt in centuries: recognition. The humans stood with reverence, not conquest. They approached as if meeting an elder at the end of a long journey. And for the first time in its long life, Longkeeper prepared to share its secrets with those who were ready to listen. Dr. Hale took out a long, hollow tool, an increment borer. To many trees, such a tool would have been alarming, but she worked with a respectful slowness, speaking softly as she positioned it. "We'll take only a pencil-thin sliver," she promised. "You won't be harmed."
Her words were sincere. She believed deeply that trees deserved dignity. With careful turns of the handle, she drew out a narrow core, the thickness of a finger, a perfect timeline from bark to heartwood. Her students leaned over the sample, their faces bright with curiosity. "Look at that," one gasped. "It's beautiful." The rings were clearly visible. Light bands, dark bands, thick bands, thin ones, each representing a single year in Longkeeper's life. Dr. Hale placed the cord gently into a labeled tray. "Every ring tells us something," she said. "The wide rings show warm, wet years. The narrow rings mark droughts or cold spells. Fire scars, flood years, volcanic ash deposits, these all leave signatures in the wood." She pointed to a cluster of thin rings. "See these? Mid-1500s drought, one of the harshest in pre-colonial North America." Another ring pattern caught her eye, several rings darkened by unusual chemical traces. "Wildfire," she murmured. "Probably lightning started, late 1600s. She touched the core with a kind of reverence. "This tree remembers everything." Her students stared at the wooden spiral with newfound respect. They saw not just wood, but time itself, layered, preserved, and still whispering its stories. Longkeeper could feel the attention of the humans. It was strange to be read like a book after centuries of silence, but also strangely comforting. Trees do not experience pride the way humans do, but Longkeeper felt something close to satisfaction. Its memories had not been collected in vain. One ring in particular, deep toward the heartwood, held the memory of a violent storm. Back in the 1600s, Longkeeper had endured lightning so fierce it split a neighboring chestnut clean in half. The crack had shaken the ground. Wind had whipped through the forest like a wild spirit. The ring that year was narrow and dark, marked by the stress of recovering from the storm. Dr. Hale recognized it at once. "This one tells of trauma," she explained. "Trees under stress grow differently. The cell walls thicken. Growth slows. You can see the struggle." Even more remarkable were the peaceful stretches, decades of wide, even rings, when rainfall was abundant, temperatures mild, and the forest thrived. "These are the golden years of the tree's life," Dr. Hale said with a smile. "Centuries of balance." One student asked, "Can a tree remember happiness?" Dr. Hale paused thoughtfully. "I think they remember peace," she answered, "and peace is a kind of happiness." Longkeeper rustled its leaves softly at that. If the tree had a face, it might have smiled. In the mid-1700s, when the land was shifting in ways the forest only dimly understood, there came a year now known as the Great Smoke Year. Across much of the continent, distant volcanic eruptions sent ash into the sky, dimming the sun for months. The temperatures dropped, and crops across the young colonies struggled. Longkeeper still bore the signature of that strange year. The ring was tight, cold-colored, and lined with microscopic traces of atmospheric sulfur. Dr. Hale saw it at once. "Here," she said, tapping the sample with a gloved finger. "This is 1783, the year of the Icelandic eruption. The ash reached North America." Her students marveled. How can a tree remember something happening halfway across the world? Because the atmosphere is shared, and trees listen to the atmosphere. Longkeeper stood proudly still. The memory of that dim summer had been a lonely one until now. As the team continued studying the core, they found other extraordinary details. Pollen grains from plants that no longer grew in the region, charcoal flecks from ancient fires long faded from historical record, chemical traces from old floods that had reshaped the land. Every detail was a word, every ring a sentence, every century a chapter in a vast wooden autobiography. The rings from the 1860s were particularly striking. Though Longkeeper stood far from battlefields, the land experienced a series of erratic seasons, harsh winters followed by unpredictable droughts.
These disturbances, Dr. Hale explained, are often tied to industrial changes, massive human migrations, and shifts in land use. Trees record not just natural weather, but the ripple effects of human history. Longkeeper remembered those years vividly, not through sound or sight, but through tension in its fibers, the hunger of its roots, and the uneasy quiet that had filled the forest as humans fought one another far beyond the tree's reach. In the 1900s, parts of the forest were logged. Longkeeper watched companions fall to axes and saws. The loss did not scar its rings, but it scarred its spirit in ways deeper and more ancient. Still, it grew. Even in loss, trees choose growth.
Dr. Hale traced these rings gently. "See here," she said. "Early 1900s, wide growth, a stable climate." But then, her finger paused on a series of narrow rings. 1930s, the Dust Bowl. Longkeeper remembered those dry years too. Even though it stood far from the Great Plains, the drought had reached deep into the continent. And here, she added, mid-20th century, industrial pollutants. You can see chemical traces in the lignin. Her voice softened. Trees tell the truth even when people forget it. After collecting samples, the students sat in a semicircle on the forest floor as Dr. Hale delivered a quiet lecture under Longkeeper's shade. "When you cut into a tree, you are not just cutting wood," she said. "You're reading time. Every dark line is winter. Every pale line is summer. Every scar is a story. Trees record droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, insect plagues, and even the rise and fall of civilizations. Some trees in the Southwest hold rings older than the pyramids. Some bristlecone pines remember the last ice age. And yet, they grow, they endure, they outlive us, and then they teach us." One student asked, "Do trees know we're studying them?" "Maybe not as we know," she replied, looking up at Longkeeper's branches, "but I believe they sense respect, and that is enough." As the team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, a breeze moved through the canopy. Leaves shivered and branches swayed as though the trees were offering a farewell. Longkeeper felt a swelling of something like gratitude. For centuries it had carried memories silently. Now, at last, someone had listened. And in that exchange, tree offering memory, human offering understanding, the forest felt a rare and beautiful balance. A month later, back in the university lab, the students examined Longkeeper's core under microscopes. They plotted graphs, marked climate shifts, and built timelines based on the tree's wooden diary. But the story they carried in their hearts mattered more than the numbers. They had seen firsthand that trees were not passive background to human history. They were witnesses, participants, keepers of time. Trees had survived storms fiercer than any human war, droughts longer than any recession, fires hotter than any political conflict, and yet they still reached upward, always reaching for light. The students wrote final papers titled things like Longkeeper, a climate story through 6 centuries, Reading the Forest as Archive, Rings as Memory. And Dr. Hale wrote her own quiet note in her field journal. There is no history of America without the history written in its trees. Back in the woods, seasons continued their eternal cycle. Winter cooled the air and frosted the outer bark of Longkeeper. Spring brought buds and soft rains. Summer warmed the sap. Autumn painted the leaves gold. And, as it had done for nearly 600 years, Longkeeper grew another ring, another line in its endless memoir. Next year, it would grow another, and another after that. And long after Dr. Hale and her students became memories themselves,
Longkeeper would continue documenting the story of the land, because that is what trees do. They remember, they endure, they hold time inside them, quietly, faithfully, year after year. And in the grain of every trunk, if one looks closely enough, lies a soft spiral of time, an invitation to listen. High in the rugged mountains of the American West, where clouds move slowly and the light feels older somehow, stand the ancient sequoias, beings so immense, so enduring, that even time seems to bow gently as it passes by. To walk among them is to feel the thin veil of the present slip aside, replaced by something quieter, deeper, almost reverent. Here, the air is laced with the cool scent of earth and resin, and the sunlight filters through the high canopy in golden ribbons that float like the remnants of dreams. The sequoias are not merely trees, they are monuments of patience, not carved from stone, but from centuries of wind, flame, rain, and the persistent will to keep growing. Some have lived for 2,000 years, some 3. A rare handful have stretched their lifetimes into 4 millennia, brushing the outer edges of recorded civilization. These trees have borne witness to the rise and fall of empires continents away, the migrations of animals now extinct, and the transformations of the American landscape long before the first map ever marked its borders. And yet, for all their strength, they have never demanded attention. They do not roar or rush or boast. They stand silently, guardians of eras that the human mind can barely comprehend. This is their story, told in the hush of forest mornings, in the marks fire left on their bark, and in the deep-rooted calm of beings who have learned to endure.
The western ranges, Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, and smaller mountain families tucked into the landscape are places shaped by dramatic geology. Granite cliffs jut upward like the ribs of the earth, and valleys cradle rivers that once carved their way through stone with a persistence not unlike the trees themselves. Within these mountains, pockets of ancient forest sit like cathedrals, hidden until the visitor rounds a bend and finds themselves dwarfed by living pillars rising hundreds of feet into the sky. There is a quiet confidence in these forests, as if they know something the rest of the world has forgotten. The sequoias grow slowly but powerfully, roots spread wide rather than deep, intertwining with the roots of neighbors in a network of silent cooperation. Their bark, fibrous, soft to the touch, and thick enough to stop most flames, reddens in the sunlight, giving the giants their distinctive glow. To step into this realm is to realize how new humanity truly is. Even the old footpaths carved by indigenous peoples centuries ago feel recent compared to the trees beside them. Under a canopy nearly impossible to see from the forest floor, time behaves differently. Hours dilate, heartbeats soften, and the sound of the wind becomes a language that feels older than memory. Long before the arrival of settlers, long before even the first migrations of native peoples into the region, the sequoias were already well into their long lives. In the earliest centuries of their existence, the mountains were wilder, ruled by Ice Age forces, and roamed by creatures such as the American lion and the shaggy mammoth. Snowpacks were heavier, winters lasted longer, but the sequoias, built for endurance, grew patiently through it all. They developed thick bark to resist moderate fires. They dropped enormous cones filled with tiny seeds that could lie unharmed for years. They let lightning scar their trunks without surrendering to it. A single tree might require decades to add a few feet of height, and yet, over the centuries, their persistence accumulated into greatness. To survive was not their strategy, but their identity. And so, they grew. When the ancient glaciers retreated and the land warmed, the sequoias adapted. When indigenous tribes eventually settled nearby, developing trade routes and seasonal camps, the trees simply watched, untroubled by the soft human presence moving through the valleys.
The world changed, but the guardians remained. For indigenous nations such as the Mono, Yokuts, Washoe, and other neighboring peoples, the sequoias were sacred long before the phrase public land ever existed. They recognized that these trees did not merely grow from the land, they shaped the land. Their roots held water, their fallen trunks sheltered animals, their branches fed the soil with needles that decomposed slowly, keeping the earth rich and steady. And perhaps most importantly, the trees had a deep relationship with fire. Many indigenous communities practiced controlled burning, a tradition of stewardship passed down through generations. These small, deliberate fires cleared brush, encouraged new growth, protected food sources, and reduced the intensity of naturally occurring wildfires. To the sequoias, these gentle burns were not threats, but blessings. Their thick bark shielded them, and the heat helped release seeds from their cones. Without fire, young sequoias struggled to grow at all. The forest floor became crowded with shade-loving plants that blocked sunlight from reaching the seedlings. Indigenous peoples understood this. Their fires did not frighten the giants, they nourished them. For thousands of years, humans and sequoias lived in a kind of harmony, each shaping the other's world in quiet ways. In a sense, these trees are not merely ancient, they are ancestral. When European settlers began pushing westward in the mid-1900s, they encountered a wilderness far more immense than anything they had imagined. Early travelers rode a forest so vast and quiet that they felt like walking into eternity. The sequoias, in particular, left them speechless. Many could not believe such trees existed at all. Some early accounts described them as illusions, exaggerations, or impossible creations of a landscape exaggerated by distance. But as more settlers arrived, miners during the gold rush, loggers following the timber trade, explorers seeking knowledge, the reality of these giants became undeniable. Their size was not the only thing that startled newcomers, it was their age. The idea that a tree could be older than the entire history of European settlement in North America was incomprehensible to people accustomed to landscapes that had been shaped, cultivated, or fenced for centuries. Some settlers reacted with awe, others reacted with saws. Logging companies moved in, believing the massive trunks could produce extraordinary amounts of lumber, but the wood of sequoias, though strong when alive, splintered easily after falling. Many giants that had stood for millennia shattered into useless fragments upon hitting the ground. Still, the cutting continued for years, driven more by spectacle than practicality. The destruction shocked a growing number of Americans who believed some parts of the land should remain untouched. From this concern emerged a new concept: protected forests, national parks, conservation not as a hobby but as a responsibility. The sequoias, still standing tall through the smoke and noise, became icons of this early environmental movement. The sequoia's relationship with fire is one of the greatest paradoxes in American ecology. Flames can scar them, but they rarely kill them. Instead, fire opens the forest, clears space for sunlight, and allows a new generation of giants to rise. But the fires of the 19th and 20th centuries were not the gentle, seasonal burns indigenous communities once set. After decades of fire suppression, a mistaken policy founded on the mistaken belief that all fire is harmful, the forests became choked with debris. When lightning eventually struck, or when drought dried the land, fires burned hotter, higher, and far more violently than before. Modern scientists began to realize what indigenous people had known for thousands of years. The forest needs fire, but not the kind that consumes every living thing in its path. Gradually, land managers reintroduced controlled burns, and the sequoias responded with vigor. After years of struggling to regenerate, seedlings finally found the open, sunlit soil they needed. The guardians, though scarred, endured once more. Yet recent decades have brought challenges unlike any before: drought, climate shifts, fires hotter than the bark of even the oldest giants can withstand. Some groves have lost trees believed to be nearly 3,000 years old, losses that shook scientists and local communities deeply. Still, many sequoias survived when no one expected them to.
they are not merely symbols of longevity, they are symbols of resilience. Every sequoia carries a library within its trunk, a multi-layered record of storms, seasons, and centuries. Scientists who study tree rings can see traces of natural events long forgotten by people. The droughts that parched the land before written history, the years when rainfall doubled, the seasons when wildfires passed quietly through the forest. One tree might bear the memory of a lightning strike in the year a medieval king in Europe was crowned. Another might show rings corresponding to a massive volcanic eruption half a world away. In this way, the trees connect human history to natural history, reminding us that our stories exist within a larger, universal timeline. Visitors who walk through the great groves often tilt their heads back, trying and failing to see the tops of the giants. Deep inside those trunks lie the quiet footprints of time. Every ring is a whisper from a past none of us lived, but all of us inherited. Imagine stepping into one of these groves at dawn. Mist lingers between the trunks, moving slowly as if reluctant to leave. The first light of morning glows soft gold on the bark, making the forest feel both ancient and newly born. You take a few steps, and the ground gives softly beneath your feet, layers of needles, soil, and centuries of natural compost. The air is still and cool. Birdsong echoes faintly far above you, where branches mingle with the sky. Your footsteps sound small, almost shy. Then you reach the base of a sequoia so wide it feels like the wall of a great wooden fortress. You place your palm against the bark, which is surprisingly soft, springy, and warm despite the morning chill.
You know the statistics. The tree is over 200 feet tall, perhaps 25 feet in diameter, maybe 1,800 years old. But knowing those things doesn't prepare you for the feeling of standing in its presence. It feels like meeting a mountain that learned how to grow. You walk on, another giant appears, then another, until the forest becomes a gathering of titans, quiet, patient, each with a story too large for any book. And for a moment, you understand why so many visitors describe this place not as a forest, but as a sanctuary. Today, the sequoias remain among the most cherished natural treasures in the United States. Families visit them year after year. Scientists study them with reverence. Conservationists work tirelessly to protect them, guided by both indigenous wisdom and modern research. Challenges remain, certainly. Climate change has made fires more intense and droughts more frequent. But the efforts to preserve the sequoias have also grown stronger. Controlled burns are returning, seed banks are collecting the genetics of the oldest trees, communities are learning from the past instead of fighting against it, and through it all, the giants stand, not unshaken, but unbroken. They remind us of endurance, of humility, of the quiet power of patience. If the forests of America have a heartbeat, it may well echo from within the trunks of these ancient beings. What the sequoias teach us is simple, yet rarely understood. To endure, you do not need to resist change. You need to grow with it. To thrive, you do not need to stand alone. You need to grow beside others. And to leave a legacy, you do not need to shout. You only need to stand tall. The sequoias have done all this for millennia. Their survival is not an accident. It is a testament to the power of ecosystems working in harmony, of fire used wisely, of communities who respect the land, of people willing to protect what they cannot replace. In their presence, the noise of modern life fades. Deadlines, worries, news cycles, and arguments shrink to the size of a pine needle. What remains is the quiet truth that some things are worth preserving simply because they remind us of who we are and who we could become. One day, children yet to be born will walk these same forest paths. They will look up and experience that same breath-catching awe their parents felt, and their grandparents, and so many before them. They will touch the bark of giants whose roots stretch into centuries far older than the nation that protects them. And perhaps one child,
quiet, curious, will place their hand on the trunk of a sequoia and feel the hum of history beneath their fingers. They will not know the full story, because no one truly can, but they will know, in a simple, instinctive way, that they are touching something ancient and good. The silent guardians will still be there if we choose to let them be. The ancient sequoias of the West are more than natural wonders. They are witnesses, they are teachers, they are living bridges between the world that was and the world that will be. In their silence, they speak of endurance. In their scars, they speak of survival. In their towering presence, they speak of time itself, vast, patient, and always moving forward. And so the guardians stand, reddish gold in the mountain light, holding centuries in their rings and hope in their crowns. If ever there were a place where the past still breathes, it is here, in the forest of giants. Before the east coast of the United States became a mosaic of highways, harbors, and coastal cities, it was a land shaped by forests so thick and ancient that the sky was something glimpsed only through trembling leaves. Long before Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or Charleston existed even as ideas, the ancient oaks and towering white pines stood as the continent's early guardians. They watched from the edges of rivers, from coastal cliffs, from inland valleys and ridgelines. Some were already hundreds of years old before European maps had ever drawn a line across the Atlantic. The people who lived in this land, the Lenape, Wampanoag, Powhatan, Cherokee, Catawba, Pequot, Abenaki, and many others, knew these trees intimately. They used their shade for council meetings, their wood for canoes, their leaves and bark for medicine. They understood the quiet language of the East Coast elders long before colonists ever stepped into their shadow. But even earlier still, when the last ice sheets had retreated and the land was cold but waking, the oaks began spreading their wide, generous crowns, while the white pines rose straight and true, like the ribs of the sky. They grew season after season, year after year, until their trunks became the width of small houses, and their branches became ecosystems of their own. They did not know what the land would become. They only knew how to stand, how to root, and how to endure. The white oak, the red oak, the chestnut oak, the black oak, each species had its role in the shaping of early American landscapes. But the oldest of them, the white oak, became something of a legend across the colonies. These were the trees that could grow for centuries, their limbs spreading like arms in perpetual welcome. In the centuries before cities, these oaks served as landmarks the same way tall church steeples would later be. People named them. They used the trees as boundaries, meeting points, and symbols of permanence. One oak might mark where a river bend opened into a valley, another where families gathered for seasonal festivals. Some were so wide that entire groups of hunters stood beneath their crowns to escape sudden storms. The roots of these oaks sank deep into the narratives of the land's first peoples. They believed them to be wise ones, timekeepers, living beings who learned from the soil and sky. Stories were told under them, but stories also came from them. There was a belief that if you pressed your palm against the thick, grooved bark and remained quiet long enough, the oak's spirit might whisper something from its long memory, a teaching, a warning, or a comfort. As centuries passed, storms snapped limbs, fires charred bark, and winters froze sap, but the elders grew on. When the first ships appeared on the eastern horizon, the oaks were ready to witness history shift. Where the oaks spread wide, the white pines soared. These were trees that grew straight and true, as tall as cathedral spires. Some reached 150 feet or more, their trunks so straight that early Europeans believed they were perfect timber, a phrase they repeated with a mixture of awe and ambition. Indigenous peoples used the pines differently. They used their resin to seal tools and their needles for medicine. They built canoes from their trunks, long, narrow vessels capable of gliding across rivers and coastal waters. They respected the pine's clarity of purpose, the way it grew upward without wavering, the way it caught dawnlight more quickly than any other tree.
For many tribes, the pine symbolized longevity and peace. Some nations planted 5 needle pines to represent unity among clans or tribes. The Iroquois Confederacy famously used the image of a white pine with its outstretched roots symbolizing peace radiating in all directions. These tall trees were not just wood, they were philosophy. But soon, new arrivals would look upon them with different eyes. The first European settlers who walked onto East Coast shores found themselves humbled by the forests around them. To many, the trees seemed impossibly tall, impossibly old, impossibly thick. They had come from countries where forests had been cleared, reshaped, or parceled for centuries. But here, trees shaped the map. Diaries from early colonists described trees so large 24 people could not encircle them. They wrote of forests so dense no sunlight could touch the ground, and pines so tall they disappeared into fog. Many settlers feared the woods, others felt drawn in by their abundance, but all recognized that the trees were a defining feature of their new world. As settlements grew, these elders became part of the emerging American identity. They shaded early farms and blacksmith shops. They marked the edges of meeting houses. They provided lumber for cabins, inns, and barns. The white pine became the mast of choice for ships built in Boston, Portsmouth, and Newport. Some were so massive that moving them required hundreds of workers and teams of oxen. Wherever a new town rose, oaks and pines stood at its edge, silent witnesses to beginnings. By the mid-1700s, the East Coast had changed dramatically. Towns bustled, harbors thrived, and forests were both useful and symbolic. In fact, the white pine became so important that it indirectly helped fuel the American Revolution. The British Crown had claimed the largest, straightest pines as king's pines, marking them with a broad arrow symbol. These were reserved exclusively for the Royal Navy. Colonists, however, often ignored these restrictions. Many had spent generations working the land and felt it unfair that trees growing on their property were not truly theirs. Conflicts erupted. There were pine tree riots in New Hampshire and Maine, rebellious acts that preceded the Boston Tea Party. The pine tree became a symbol of independence. Some early revolutionary flags even depicted it as the emblem of defiance. Meanwhile, oaks played their own quiet role. Their wood formed wagon wheels, ship ribs, and homes that served as meeting places for rebels. Their branches sheltered whispered conversations about liberty. During the harsh winters of the Revolutionary War, soldiers rested under old oaks near encampments, warming themselves against trunks that had stood through centuries of earlier storms. The East Coast elders, without ever meaning to, became part of the birth of a nation. After the Revolution, America grew rapidly. Cities expanded, roads cut through once continuous forests, farms stretched into valleys that had been green for millennia. But even as the land shifted, certain trees remained untouched, protected by community affection, local legend, or sheer luck. Some oaks became charter trees, under which branches early town documents had been signed. Others became sites of community gatherings, speeches, celebrations, or even reckonings. In the new nation, some trees were named after presidents, Washington oak, Jefferson pine, or after military victories, or after families who had farmed the land for generations. These trees became anchors for communities, reminders that before the world sped up, patience and endurance had shaped the land. Travelers in the 1800s often wrote about their encounters with the great East Coast trees. A traveler in Virginia described a white oak whose branches spread as wide as a mansion roof. A visitor in Massachusetts wrote of a pine so tall its highest needle catches the earliest sun on the Atlantic. In Pennsylvania, a naturalist recorded sitting under a black oak whose trunk showed scars from fires that had burned long before the Declaration of Independence.
These trees were not simply decoration, they were historical figures stitched into the fabric of American identity. Over the centuries, hurricanes roared along the Atlantic coast, tearing through forests with winds that pulled shingles off houses and lifted boats from harbors. Winter storms layered the trees in ice so thick that branches snapped under the weight. Summers brought droughts that cracked the soil around their roots. But the oldest trees held on. Oaks bent slowly, their wood flexing rather than breaking. Pines let wind pass through their long, flexible branches like breath through hair. Fire moved through forests, but the thick bark of the elders shielded them from the worst. Some trees lived through storms so fierce that neighborhoods afterwards used them as landmarks of survival. "That old oak still stands," people would say after a hurricane, "so we'll rebuild." In this way, the East Coast elders became symbols not only of history, but of hope. As the centuries went on, the oaks and pines continued to watch over the land. They watched canals give way to railroads, which gave way to highways. They saw wooden ships replaced by steam, then steel, then sky-crossing aircraft. They saw cities rise like forests of glass and stone. Yet the oldest trees remained grounded in the soil of earlier times. Some oaks became the subjects of painters and poets. Others became fixtures in local folklore. One oak in Maryland was said to be so old it had stood when the first English settlers landed. A pine in Maine was believed to be the tallest in the East. In Connecticut, a famed oak was used as a hiding place for the state's colonial charter during a moment of political crisis, earning it a permanent place in American legend. People picnicked beneath these trees, carved their initials into them, a habit less appreciated by the trees themselves, or gathered under them for weddings. Families took photographs in front of the same oak for generations, documenting their lives by the slow growth of a tree still older than all of them combined. The East Coast elders had become more than trees. They had become part of the human story. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it became clear that many of these ancient trees were disappearing. Development, logging, and disease took a toll. Some of the greatest forests of the colonial era were nearly gone. But just as it happened in the West with the sequoias, a movement to protect the eastern giants grew stronger. Conservationists, naturalists, indigenous leaders, and local communities all played roles. They advocated for the protection of old-growth forests, for the preservation of historic trees, and for the recovery of ecosystems shaped long before modern America existed. National parks and state parks began preserving large stretches of woodland. Urban planners built parks around ancient oaks instead of cutting them down. Schools named after massive old trees became community centers of pride.
In some places, towns rallied to save a single giant oak or pine, raising funds and awareness to ensure the elder would stand for another generation. The trees, once simply part of the landscape, had become beloved elders, respected, honored, and fiercely protected. Imagine stepping into one of the remaining old-growth forests of the East, places like the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, the Congaree Swamp of South Carolina, the Great Smoky Mountains, the Pennsylvania Wilds, or the pockets of ancient woodland still present in New England. The air is rich and earthy, filled with a scent that can be found nowhere else on Earth, a deep, grounding aroma of leaf mold, pine resin, and centuries of quiet decomposition. Sunlight filters through the high canopy in soft columns, moving slowly as the day passes. Beneath your feet, the ground is lined with roots that may have held the soil steady through 100 storms. Slowly, you come upon an oak so large its shadow feels like a room. Its bark is ridged and thick, marked by time in a dozen subtle ways. You place your hand upon it, feeling the coolness of a living being older than the town you live in, older than many of the stories you grew up hearing. Farther along the trail, you find a pine whose trunk rises straight into the sky like a pillar made of time. You tilt your head back, but still you cannot see the top.
The branches sway lightly in the wind, quiet but purposeful. Standing among these trees, the rush of the modern world falls away. Deadlines fade, noise fades, even language feels like something unnecessary. In this moment, the trees are the storytellers. They tell of a land before borders, a land before cities, a land where the present was not rushed, but allowed to unfold gently, like shade gathering at the end of a long summer day. What the East Coast elders teach us is simple and profound. Endurance is not loud, it is quiet, patient, steady. Strength does not always reach up first. Sometimes it spreads outward, rooting deep before rising. History is not only written in books, it is written in bark, in rings, in the scars left by storms. Change can be met not with fear, but with resilience. These trees watched indigenous nations build complex, thriving societies. They watched settlers arrive with hope and hardship entwined. They watched cities rise, wars unfold, storms reshape coasts, and people return again and again seeking peace beneath their branches. And through every era, before America had roads, laws, or a name, the oaks and pines stood as constants. They remain so today. The East Coast elders are more than biological marvels. They are living historians. In their shade lies the memory of early America. In their roots lies the stability the land has always needed. In their branches lies the promise that resilience, when nurtured, can span centuries. As long as these trees remain, the story of America's beginnings remains alive, not in dusty archives or forgotten diaries, but in the quiet, steady presence of giants who have watched it all. Their leaves still rustle with centuries of stories. Their trunks still stand against the winds of change, and for any who walk among them, they offer a gentle reminder. History is not always behind us. Sometimes it stands right beside us, breathing quietly in the form of an ancient tree. There are trees in America, quiet, unassuming, deeply rooted, that have watched the rise and fall of human ambition with a patience no civilization has ever mastered. They stand in forgotten hollows, on wind-swept ridges, in sandy coastal plains, and along rivers that have changed course more than any human remembers. If they could speak, their stories would not be recorded in books or proclaimed by marble monuments. They would whisper softly in the creak of their branches and the rustle of their needles. That time is not a straight line, but a tide. In tides, whether of people or empires, always recede. To sit beneath such a tree is to sit beneath the arc of history itself. Their presence is a quiet lesson. We are brief, but they are enduring. This is their story. Long before America was inked onto any map, long before Europe dreamed of the land across the sea, and long before any empire laid its claim to greatness, the ancient trees rooted themselves in soil still young with geological memory. 2,000 years ago, a small spruce sapling pushed its first green needles into the mountain air of what would later be called the Rockies. At the same time, a bristlecone pine, already old by human standards, added a new, thin ring of growth, unaware that it would one day become one of the oldest living organisms on Earth. Along the Atlantic coast, an oak took root near a tidal river long before the river had the same shape it has today. Above them, storms moved, seasons changed, fires swept through, and ice crusted their branches. They knew nothing of borders, nothing of empires, nothing of the people who would one day argue over maps and flags. The trees simply lived, patiently, quietly, consistently. Back then, the world belonged to the timeless, and while distant civilizations flourished, these trees stood still. While the ancient forests of North America stretched in every direction, empires elsewhere in the world sharpened their ambitions. In Rome, soldiers marched stone roads that would one day crumble. Senators argued beneath carved ceilings, believing their political struggles would echo through eternity. In dynasties across Asia, emperors ruled from palaces adorned with lacquered wood and silks, confident that the world they built would endure. In Africa and the Middle East, bustling trade centers hummed with voices discussing wealth and power as though both were everlasting. But when those civilizations rose, the trees in America did not stir. A pine did not glance toward the Mediterranean. An oak did not lean to listen to the bustle of cities thousands of miles away. The forests remained anchored in their slow rhythm of growth. Empires believed themselves immortal. The trees knew better. While distant worlds shifted, indigenous peoples lived in close relationship with the forests for thousands of years. They moved lightly on the land, leaving no concrete jungles or stone monuments. Their stories threaded through the woods like rivers finding their course, and they understood the timelessness around them.
Some tribes believed that the oldest trees were the first beings to learn the language of the earth. Others believed trees remembered every footstep, animal, human, or spirit. For many, the forest was not a place to conquer, but a place to listen. Under the shade of old oaks and pines, people gathered for generations. Children played among roots that had been there longer than their great-grandparents' great-grandparents. Hunters thanked the trees for shelter. Elders leaned against trunks that had been alive before any known story began. The timeline of the land was gentle, unbroken. Life here didn't need to shout to be meaningful. Then, one day, something new happened. At first, the trees didn't notice. Why would they? The winds still carried the same rhythms, and the animals still followed their ancient trails. But along the Atlantic coast, changes whispered between the branches. The smell of smoke became sharper. The sound of axes appeared where silence once reigned. Footsteps grew heavier, less like the soft tread of tribes who had lived with the land, and more like a determined march. Ships arrived. Not one ship, not one voyage, but waves of them. People stepped onto the soil carrying languages the trees had never heard. Some came hopeful, some desperate, some driven by ambition. The trees watched a familiar story begin once again, a rising tide. Empires always reached outward before they collapsed inward. Still, the trees held their ground, as they always had. As settlements grew, the forests felt the first true pain of their long lives. Oak groves that had survived centuries were cut down to build homes, ships, and towns. Pines older than any memory were harvested for masts and lumber. Ancient forests receded like retreating waves, leaving shadows of their former selves behind. If trees felt grief, they carried it silently. Yet in the deepest hollows, on the rockiest hillsides, in soil too poor or mountains too steep, pockets of the ancient ones endured. Some were spared intentionally by indigenous groups who continued to honor the trees. Others survived by sheer luck. Even as wars were fought, borders were drawn, and the nation that would become America began to take shape, the old trees watched calmly. They had seen the rise of nations before, and they would see the fall of some too. By the 1800s, the world around these trees changed faster than ever before. Railroads sliced through mountains, factories belched smoke, cities grew with a speed that made forests seem primitive. Yet the oldest trees remained unmoved. A 1,500-year-old bristlecone pine in what would become Nevada gained only a thin new ring each year. It could not have rushed even if it tried. A coastal live oak in the south watched enslaved people labor under a system as cruel as any empire from ancient history. Generations passed beneath its branches, some suffering, some resisting, and the tree bore witness to all of it. After the Civil War, after Reconstruction, after the swirl of progress and conflict that marked the Industrial Age, some of these trees were still standing. They had lived through entire chapters of human transformation, yet their greatest change remained simply another ring. Humans counted history by events. The trees counted it by seasons. In the 20th century, world wars erupted. Wars that redrew borders, toppled monarchies, and shattered illusions of endless empire.
Soldiers crossed oceans, alliances shifted, and new nations rose from the ashes of old ones. But in the American wilderness, the ancient trees kept their quiet vigil. A pine high in the Sierra Nevada stood through the entirety of World War I without so much as losing a branch. A white oak in the Appalachian foothills added a ring during the Great Depression, another during the rise of modern America, and another during World War II. For the tree, these were simply years of rain or drought, sunlight or shade. The trees were comfortingly indifferent to human drama. Civilizations trembled, the trees stood firmly rooted. The modern age sped forward faster than any era before it. Man landed on the moon, satellites circled overhead. Technology redefined what a moment meant. Communications stretched across continents instantly. Empires took new shapes, not merely nations, but corporations, digital systems, global networks of influence. Humans stood taller, built higher, moved faster, but speed has never impressed the ancient trees. Their wisdom is slow. A 2,000-year-old juniper in Utah didn't sway when the latest technologies emerged. A giant sequoia, older than many recorded religions, continued its slow, steady growth. A bald cypress in the swamps added its rings in the same patient cycle it had followed since the Roman Empire's fall. The trees remained the counterweight to human urgency. To sit with an ancient tree is to feel history stretching around you like a great circle. Time softens. You begin to sense what the tree knows. Empires rise, but they are temporary. Conflict burns hot, then fades. Fear is a moment. Endurance is a rhythm. Human life is a story. Nature is the library. The trees are not eternal, but they approach something close to it in the scale of human understanding. They hold the perspective we lose in our rush to build, to conquer, to achieve. They remind us that longevity is not about domination, it is about harmony, consistency, and patient survival. The old-growth forests teach us that nothing truly endures unless it grows slowly. In recent generations, people began to rediscover the value of ancient trees. Scientists dated their rings with awe. Environmentalists fought to protect the last groves. Families visited national parks to marvel at giants that predated entire civilizations. Children stood before sequoias and whispered, "It's older than everything." And the trees, as always, did not boast. They simply kept growing. Even in a world shaped by digital speed and global complexity, the forests offered something deeply human, deeply American, a sense of belonging to a larger timeline, a reassurance that not everything is fleeting, not everything fragile. In protecting the ancient trees, people found themselves protecting something within their own hearts, a need for continuity, for perspective, for connection to the infinite. It is humbling to realize that many of the trees alive today will outlive every building we construct, every political era, every invention, every boundary on every map. When our century becomes a chapter in a distant textbook, these trees may still stand.
They will outlive fashion and social arguments and economic cycles. They will outlive the lifespan of our current cities. They may even outlive our current understanding of the world. And one day, when future generations walk beneath their branches, they will be reminded, just as we are reminded, that life is larger than the moment we occupy. The trees that outlived empires give us the comfort of scale. We are not meant to carry the weight of forever. We are meant to take our place in the cycle, learn from the past, protect what endures, and marvel at the long arc of time that stretches beyond us. As the sun sets on another day, just one of tens of thousands the oldest trees have witnessed, the forests fall into the same familiar stillness they have known for centuries. A breeze moves through their branches, and the soft whispering sound resembles something like peace. It is a reminder that even in times of uncertainty or change, there are anchors in this world older than worry, older than conflict, older than any human idea of permanence. The trees promise nothing except what they have always offered: shade to those who seek shelter, silence to those who need rest, perspective to those who feel overwhelmed, continuity in a world obsessed with change, and perhaps most importantly, the reassurance that life outlasts the storms, the land remembers, and time is far more patient than we imagine. The oldest trees that outlived empires stand as steady, gentle giants, living reminders that while human history rises and falls like the tide, nature keeps its own timeless rhythm, unhurried and undisturbed. There is comfort in remembering this, for as long as the ancient ones continue to grow, so does hope. If the oldest trees of America could speak, they would not tell their stories in the language of paper maps or timelines. They would speak in centuries, in rings of thickened wood, in scars burned black by lightning, or carved into their trunks by wind-driven debris. They would recall tempests the way elders recall childhood, a distant memory, softened by time, but never forgotten. For as long as they have stood, storms have been their greatest test and their greatest teacher. And while many storms were fierce enough to terrify humans, the ancient trees weathered them with a resilience that bordered on the miraculous. This is the story of the storms they survived, and what their survival tells us about endurance, patience, and the profound wisdom of nature's elders. Before the arrival of European settlers, before the founding of towns or colonies, before even the beginnings of many indigenous legends, there was weather. Furious, unrestrained, unpredictable weather. 10,000 years ago, when ice sheets began withdrawing from the continent, the climate was wilder than today. Summers burned hotter, winters dropped colder, and storms tore across the land without warning. It was a world in transition, and in that shifting landscape, the first ancestors of today's ancient trees took root. They grew slowly, bristlecones on high rocky slopes, bald cypresses in the humid wetlands, Douglas firs in the coastal northwest, white pines in the east. With every passing season, they learned the language of wind and sky. They learned how the air thickened just before a lightning strike. They learned how the soil loosened after heavy rain, and how to grip deeper. They learned that the harsher the storm, the stronger the roots must grow. Long before humans walked beneath them, these ancient trees weathered tempests that reshaped rivers, tore cliffs apart, and uprooted forests. And they survived not through brute strength, but through flexibility. They bent when they needed to bend. They held firm when firmness was required. They grew slowly, never outpacing the land that sustained them. This slow wisdom is why today we can stand beside trees older than entire civilizations. Their first storms taught them how to endure all storms that followed. Centuries passed. Human communities flourished across the continent. Tribes learned to read the sky the way they read the land, intuitively, respectfully, with deep attention. They lived alongside the ancient trees, seeing in them the same wisdom they saw in their own elders. Some tribes believed thunder was a spirit that traveled across the heavens in a great rolling drum. Others said lightning was a sky ancestor's arrow, bringing warnings or blessings. In many stories, trees themselves were considered mediators between sky and earth, a bridge for the lightning, a grounding for the storms. When a storm struck with the ferocity of a charging beast, communities sought shelter, but the oldest trees often remained standing afterward, like guardians who refused to abandon their posts. One old oak in the southeast, already ancient by the time of the Mississippian cultures, survived hurricanes long before anyone wrote the word hurricane. A giant fir in the northwest endured windstorms that toppled forests but left it untouched. A bald cypress in the wetlands of the south stood through hurricanes so intense that even the tribes called them angry waters. Children grew up hearing stories of how the spirit of the storm tried to take down the elder tree, but the elder tree stood tall. It was never said with arrogance, only admiration. For indigenous peoples, storms were not enemies, they were teachers. Storms taught humility. Old trees taught resilience. When European settlers began writing weather journals in the 1600s, they chronicled tempests with astonishment.
Many had never seen a continent where storms behaved with such unrestrained power. A hurricane in 1635 battered the New England coast with winds so fierce that settlers described them as tempests exceeding imagination. Forests were flattened, ships were thrown onto rocks, houses were torn apart. Yet among the destruction, some ancient trees remained, scarred but standing. A towering white pine, already a century old when the first pilgrims landed, lost half its crown but kept growing another 200 years. An oak near the Chesapeake Bay stood knee-deep in floodwaters for days, but continued to leaf out spring after spring. Settlers were amazed. They had grown up in landscapes shaped by human hands, forests cleared, lands tamed. But here in the New World, the storm-worn trees were older than their nations, older than their recorded histories, even older than many of the languages spoken across Europe.
Where settlers saw devastation, the ancient trees saw another season. They had survived worse. One of the first great storms recorded across the colonies was the hurricane of 1737. It blew in from the Atlantic with winds so powerful that people said the sky turned white with sheets of rain. The storm destroyed orchards, sank ships, and ripped roofs from houses. But deep in what is now Pennsylvania, a grove of old-growth hemlocks endured. These hemlocks had already stood a millennium, rooted in stony soil that held them like anchors. As the storm raged, their trunks swayed with slow, rhythmic patience. They did not resist, they moved with the wind. When morning came, settlers emerged to find the younger, faster-growing trees snapped like matchsticks, but the elders still stood, though their branches lay scattered across the forest floor like shed memories. It was the first recorded instance where colonists realized what indigenous people had always known. The strongest trees were not the thickest or tallest. They were the slowest, the patient ones, the ones that had learned the art of moving with forces greater than themselves. Storms taught humility. Ancient trees taught endurance. Lightning has always been a sculptor of ancient trees. Many of America's oldest specimens bear long vertical scars, silver, black, or deep brown, that split their bark. These scars look like wounds, but are actually signatures of survival. A 1,000-year-old cypress in the south bears 3 such lightning scars, each a century apart. A fir in the Cascades was struck so often that the top 20 feet of its trunk eventually died and fell away. Yet its lower trunk, thick as a cottage wall, continues to grow. One legendary oak in the east was split down the center by a lightning bolt in the 1800s. Farmers thought it would die within a year. Instead, it lived another 150 years, growing 2 separate crowns like hands reaching toward the sun. Lightning rarely kills an ancient tree outright. Instead, it prunes it, it carves it, it teaches it to adapt, and the trees, in their slow wisdom, simply integrate the scar into their growth. Humans often see scars as damage. Ancient trees see them as biography. When the Mount Tambora erupted in 1815, its ash clouds circled the globe. What followed was known as the Year Without a Summer. Frost killed crops in June. Snow fell in August. Weather patterns collapsed. Storms struck unpredictably. Some came with icy rain, others with violent winds that uprooted forests weakened by cold. Yet the oldest trees again endured. A coastal redwood in California added the narrowest ring in its 2,000-year history, but it survived. A white oak in the northeast lost nearly all its leaves, but budded anew the following spring. Bristlecone pines at high elevations hunkered down in the cold, shedding only dead needles and conserving their energy. It was one of the most chaotic weather years in human memory. For the trees, it was simply another harsh season in a long life full of them. When the Sea Islands hurricane of 1893 slammed into the Atlantic coast,
It became one of the deadliest storms in American history. Entire communities were devastated. Waters surged 10 to 12 feet above normal. Winds tore apart structures like toys. But deep inland, where the storm still raged, but not with full ocean force, some of the region's oldest trees survived. A 600-year-old live oak, wide enough for 6 people to reach around, held firm against winds that uprooted entire groves nearby. Its roots ran nearly twice as far underground as its branches did above. Its trunk twisted in the storm like a great muscle. Locals later called it the island's backbone because it seemed to hold the land together when nothing else could. The next spring, it leafed out as though nothing had happened. Some beings measure time in seconds, others measure it in centuries. When the Dust Bowl ravaged the Great Plains in the 1930s, the storms were not the usual kind. They were black blizzards, massive clouds of dust driven by windstorms that shook houses and buried farms. Trees across the plains suffered. Many died. Yet some ancient cottonwoods in hardy junipers survived, precisely because they had grown slowly. They were not pampered by irrigated fields or fast-growing practices. Their roots were deep, their growth conservative, their resilience built through centuries of hardship. A cottonwood in Kansas, believed to be over 400 years old at the time, endured multiple dust storms that turned noon into night. Its bark became sandblasted smooth, its leaves stripped to skeletons, but each spring it leafed out again. After one storm, in 1935, a boy wrote in a diary, "Everything was gone, except the old tree. It stood like it knew something we didn't." It did. It knew survival. In the last century, storms grew stronger. Climate change altered coastlines, rainfall, temperature, and wind patterns. Some ancient trees fell, others endured. A giant sequoia struck by lightning in the early 2000s burned internally for weeks, yet survived because its bark was thicker than some modern buildings' walls. A 1,000-year-old cedar in the Pacific Northwest endured 400-year storms in a single decade, bending almost to the ground before righting itself again. A bristlecone pine in the mountains shrugged off blizzards that buried entire cabins. The storms grew fiercer, but the ancient ones had grown wiser. When we look at an ancient tree, we see strength, but strength is not what kept them alive. What kept them alive was adaptation, patience, and humility. Storms taught them, bend, don't break. Root deep, not wide. Grow slowly, not greedily. Shed what you can't afford to carry. Endure what cannot be escaped. Wait for the calm that always follows. In this way, trees mirrored the greatest lessons of survival, not only in forests, but in human life.
A storm is not the end. It is a season, and seasons always change. When a truly ancient tree falls, people notice. It becomes local news, sometimes national. But what many don't realize is how rare these falls are compared to the thousands of storms the tree endured successfully. Why do the oldest trees survive so many storms? Deep roots. Not shallow lawn-style roots, but roots that stretch like underground rivers. Slow growth. Slow growth builds dense wood, tree muscle. Flexible trunks. Ancient trees sway like dancers. Natural pruning. Lightning, wind, and storms remove weak limbs long before they become fatal. Wisdom of place. Ancient trees survive because they grow where survival is possible. They're not reckless pioneers, they are patient strategists. When you walk through an old-growth forest today, you see more than just trunks and branches. You see survivors, elders who lived through centuries of weather so extreme it shaped their very bodies. A burn scar tells of a burn fire in 1760. A hollow trunk speaks of a lightning strike in 1842. A twisted crown reveals where a hurricane snapped the top in 1938. A widened base shows centuries of floodwaters rising and falling. Every storm left a mark, none took their spirit. Their scars are not symbols of weakness, they are proof of endurance. There is a deep comfort in knowing that trees older than the nation have survived storms greater than any we face. They remind us, storms do not last. Nature endures. Time heals and strengthens. Survival is often quiet, patient, unnoticed. Ancient trees do not fear storms. They understand them. They have lived through thousands. And when the next one comes, they will stand as they always have, rooted not just in soil, but in time, memory, and resilience. They do not step forward, yet they move through time. They do not speak, yet they carry memories. They do not travel, yet they have witnessed worlds that have vanished. Ancient trees, America's elders of wood, leaf, and root, are the closest thing our world has to time travelers. They live in single locations for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, but across the span of those centuries, they cross eras the way a ship crosses oceans. They endure changing languages, shifting borders, rising and falling civilizations, and storms that reshape coastlines. Their journey is through time, not space. And anyone who stands beneath their branches becomes part of that long journey, even if just for a moment. This is the story of how old forests connect the past to the present, how they hold memory, share wisdom, bridge generations, and remain the quiet time travelers of America. Imagine walking into an old-growth forest. The deeper you go, the quieter everything becomes, not because the forest lacks life, but because it holds its breath in long, slow cycles. The hum of traffic fades, the chatter of modern life disappears. What remains is the presence of age. It is not simply the age of a large trunk tree or a fallen log, it is the age of the entire ecosystem, layered like rings within rings. The soil beneath your feet might be older than the country. The moss growing on a boulder may have sparked to life before modern electricity existed. The tree you pause beside could have been a seedling when indigenous trade routes crossed the continent like woven threads, long before a single European ship touched American shores. Trees exist on cycles so long that they make human history seem hurried. While we measure time in seconds, minutes, and days, trees measure time in seasons, storms, and centuries. To a tree, a human lifetime is a brief flare. A city's rise is a moment of noise. A nation's history is a chapter, significant but not the whole story. And because of their long lifespans, trees become physical bridges across time, allowing the past to remain part of the present simply by continuing to stand. Every ancient tree begins as something incredibly small, a seed no larger than a thumbnail, dropped into soil by a bird, squirrel, or breeze. That seed does not know that it will someday be an elder tree. It does not know that it will withstand storms, droughts, and the passage of centuries. It simply does what it was designed to do: grow. Let us imagine a seed falling to earth in the early 1400s in what is now Virginia, Maine, or Georgia, or in the deep woods of the Great Lakes region. There are no states yet, no cities in the European sense. Villages and indigenous nations flourish, trade flows along rivers, the land is shaped by fire, migration, and deep knowledge. The seed cracks open, a root reaches downward, a sprout reaches upward. If it survives its first decade, which is the most dangerous time in any tree's life, it may survive long enough to become ancient. By the time the sprout becomes a slender sapling, children from local tribes gather near it to play, collect nuts or pine resin, or simply enjoy the shade. They may not notice the young tree, but their footprints shape the soil around it. Their campfires leave smoke that drifts through its leaves. Their presence becomes part of its early memory. A century passes, and another still. By the time settlers arrive in the region, that small sapling is already a sturdy tree, thick with branches and rooted deeply in land that has known generations of human stories. The tree has not moved an inch, but time has moved around it. This is how trees become time travelers.
There is something quietly humbling about standing beneath a tree whose shade once fell on people who lived centuries before you were born. A present-day visitor might bring a smartphone, wearing clothes woven from synthetic fibers. They might have driven miles along a highway to get here. Their life is filled with digital calendars, screens, deadlines, and instant notifications. But they stand in the same shadow that native hunters once rested in, indigenous storytellers once sat beneath, colonial families once gathered near to escape midday heat, Civil War soldiers once marched past, early conservationists once studied, and children from 100 years ago once played under. The tree does not care about the visitor's era. It offers shade the same way it always has, generously, without hesitation. A child leaning against its trunk in 1800 would feel the same rough bark and hear the same rustling leaves that a child feels and hears today. This continuity, this unbroken thread, is what makes ancient trees living portals. They allow the past to be felt in the present, not through documents or ruins, but through moonlight shimmering on leaves that have shimmered for centuries. Every year, a tree adds a ring. The ring may be thin or thick, depending on rainfall, drought, temperature, or sunlight. When scientists examine the cross-section of an ancient trunk, they don't just see wood, they see history. A wide ring might mark a wet year when rivers swelled and fish were plentiful. A narrow ring might mark a drought that dried ponds and cracked soil. A scar ring might mark the year of a wildfire. A dark streak might signal a volcanic eruption that clouded skies across the continent. But tree rings hold more than climate. They hold human history too. A scar from 1635 may match the year of the Great Colonial Hurricane. A thin ring in the late 1700s may align with harsh winters during the American Revolution. A ring from 1816 may reflect the strange climate of the year without a summer. Early 20th century rings might bear traces of industrial soot. Late 20th century rings might show accelerated growth after pollution reforms. By reading these rings, we read the story of the land itself, its seasons, its hardships, and its endurance. The tree becomes a timeline, a record keeper, a historian who never forgot to write. While a single tree can be ancient, an entire old-growth forest is a library of time. In such a forest, every part contributes to a larger story. Fallen logs show which year's storms were strongest. Canopy gaps reveal where elders fell decades earlier. Understory shrubs reflect the sunlight patterns of past generations. Bird nests change as species migrate with warming climates. Streams shift with the rise and fall of tree roots. Soil layers hold pollen from flowers that may no longer bloom. Walking through such a forest is like flipping through a photo album where the images are made of bark, earth, and wind. A forest does not freeze time, it layers time, and each layer, each fallen leaf, each new sprout adds to the living, breathing record. For indigenous nations across North America, trees were never just resources. They were living relatives, keepers of memory, bridges between sky and earth. Many traditions described trees as life holders, storing knowledge in their rings, ancestors witnessing the passing of generations, messengers connecting humans with the spirit world, advisors teaching patience and balance, time beings older than recorded histories. When a tribal elder touched the trunk of a 1,000-year-old cedar, they touched not only wood, but the memories of their ancestors who had done the same. When families returned to the same oak over generations for ceremonies, storytelling, or counsel, they were not simply meeting beneath a plant, they were visiting a relative who had watched over them for centuries. Even today, many indigenous communities continue to treat ancient trees with deep respect, sometimes offering prayers, tobacco, or songs. These practices recognize what science also confirms, that trees are among the oldest living organisms on the continent and deserve reverence. When European settlers arrived, they were struck by the size and age of American forests. They wrote astonished journal entries about trees so wide that 10 men could not reach around them, and so tall that their crowns disappeared in the mist. Some settlers cut them down. Others studied them. Some simply stood in awe. Tree rings revealed years predating European exploration. Lightning scars dated back generations. Roots twisted around old stones and indigenous artifacts. In some areas, colonists unknowingly built towns beside trees that were already 1,000 years old. The Liberty Tree in Boston became a symbol of revolution. The great oaks of the Carolinas stood through wars and hurricanes. Massive pines of New England fed the ship masts of early America. Ancient cypresses in the South stood through battles, fires, and floods. And through all it, the trees continued their slow passage through time. Consider this. Some trees alive today took root before the Roman Empire fell. Others sprouted before Shakespeare wrote a single play. Some were already old when the first U.S. president was born. A single ancient tree may have lived through the rise and fall of indigenous civilizations, the arrival of European ships, the founding of colonies, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Industrial Age, world wars, the moon landing, the internet, and modern climate change. While humans changed their languages, clothing, governments, and technologies, the tree stood in the same place, growing, healing, and weathering storms.
It did not outlive empires by strength alone. It outlived them because it was grounded, literally and philosophically. Trees do not simply endure history, they preserve it. They hold past centuries in rings that record climate, bark that remembers fires, roots that anchor soil from older eras, branches that once sheltered long ago families, hollows where ancient animals nested, scars from storms and human activity. When we touch a tree's trunk, we touch the same wood touched by those who lived centuries before us. When we walk under its canopy, we experience the same shade felt by ancestors long gone. In this way, trees keep the past alive, not as a museum exhibit, but as a living companion. Today, people visit old forests for many reasons: to hike, to seek peace, to study ecology, to escape screens, to reconnect with something ancient. They come from cities and suburbs, wearing modern clothes and carrying digital devices. But when they step beneath the high branches of an ancient tree, time feels different, quieter, slower, more spacious. A single breath of forest air carries molecules exhaled by leaves centuries ago. A patch of shade has cooled countless generations. Time folds in on itself. Modern visitors often describe the experience not as travel backward, but as stepping outside of linear time altogether. The forest seems to whisper, "You are part of something much older than you realize." And in that moment, the visitor becomes part of the tree's story. Their shadow joins the shadows of all who came before. Trees remind us that we are temporary but not insignificant. We are part of a much longer story. The land remembers even when people forget. Slow growth can be stronger than fast progress. The future is shaped by how we treat the present. When we stand beneath an ancient tree, we realize that time does not simply move forward, it circles, spirals, returns in seasons and cycles. Trees teach us to stand firmly, adapt gently, grow slowly, listen often, endure gracefully. These are lessons no clock or calendar can provide. The trees that will become ancient centuries from now are already growing. Some may be thin saplings today, nearly invisible. Others are only seeds waiting for the right soil. Our choices determine whether they will survive long enough to become time travelers for future generations. If they do survive, then centuries from now, children will stand beneath them, families will picnic under their branches, scientists will marvel at rings from our era, poets will describe the same rustling leaves we hear now, people yet to born will share our shadows. We think of ancient trees as gifts from the past, but they are also promises to the future. Long after our present becomes history, long after today's news headlines are forgotten, long after our buildings crumble and our technology becomes obsolete, the ancient trees will continue standing, growing, breathing. They will still endure storms, still remember seasons, still cast their shade on whoever stands beneath them, and those future visitors, centuries from now, will not know your name, but they will stand where you once stood, in the same forest, under the same giant tree. They will feel the same calm, they will hear the same rustling of leaves. The tree will be older, wiser, thicker with rings, but it will still be traveling through time. And you, through your moment beneath its branches, will have become part of its story. There are places where time bends, where the air carries echoes of footsteps long since vanished, and where the earth itself remembers every path taken across its surface. Ancient forests of America are such places. Beneath their canopies, explorers, settlers, indigenous peoples, and animals have moved for centuries, leaving trails that only the patient trees can read. Some trails were worn by the gentle padding of deer, the sniffing of wolves, or the slow march of bison herds. Others were blazed by human ambition, curiosity, or survival. Every path tells a story, and yet the most remarkable aspect is not the travelers themselves, it is the forest that witnessed them all, unchanged, silent, and eternal. This is the story of those forgotten trails and the gentle history of how early Americans navigated immense forest labyrinths under the watchful eyes of the ancient trees. Long before anyone claimed the land, the forests themselves were alive with movement. Streams carved natural highways, game animals created pathways in search of food or water. Beavers shaped small channels, leaving evidence of passage for those who followed. Wolves, bison, and deer maintained constant motion, trampling down foliage into subtle roots through dense woods.
The trees observed quietly. Oak, pine, cedar, and cypress stood rooted like ancient sentinels. They had no need to move, yet they recorded every disturbance. The slight indentation of a hoof, the brushing of a tail, the fall of a branch across a frequently used corridor. In these small imprints, the forest created a living map. Human explorers, arriving much later, would unknowingly benefit from this natural cartography. Every animal path, every water crossing, every ridge cleared by wind or fire offered guidance through an otherwise impenetrable green maze. When indigenous nations populated the continent, they were the first humans to read and respect these forest maps. Hunters and gatherers knew the subtle signs of animal movement. They learned the sounds of the woods, a snapping twig signaling danger, the chatter of birds revealing a nearby water source, the rustling leaves hinting at wind patterns. They followed the natural trails carved by creatures long before them. They widened some paths slightly, leaving markers or piles of stone to indicate direction. They moved with purpose, but also with reverence. No tree was struck without reason. No trail was cut without care. Their movement through the forest was a collaboration with the trees rather than an imposition upon them. The forests became intertwined with human culture. Songs, stories, and ceremonies were tied to particular groves or ridges. Children learned to recognize the oldest oaks or the tallest pines as landmarks. Trails weren't just for travel, they were woven into the cultural memory. each step connecting past, present, and future generations. When European explorers arrived, they encountered landscapes that were both beautiful and bewildering. Unlike the cultivated fields and manicured roads of Europe, American forests seemed endless. It was easy to become lost. Thick canopies blocked the sun, ferns and underbrush hid uneven ground, streams twisted unpredictably. Yet remarkably, explorers often stumbled upon trails long before they learned to chart the terrain themselves. Paths once created by deer or bison and later refined by indigenous peoples guided them. A faint rut in the soil led to a clearing where a river could be forded. A broken branch pointed toward a natural passage through a dense copse of trees. Occasionally, they discovered old fire pits or stone markers, signs that humans had passed through this labyrinth before. The trees watched all of it. Each diary entry, each sketch of a new clearing, each note on direction was recorded silently in rings, scars, and the shifting of roots beneath the soil. To the forest, the explorers were merely another chapter in its ongoing story, a story that spanned millennia. Rivers and streams were the lifeblood of exploration. Many of the first trails paralleled water sources, and the trees grew densely along these corridors. A traveler following the riverbank would notice a line of ancient cedars or willows marking a bend, a pool, or a shallow crossing. The trees' root systems, holding the soil against erosion, maintained these paths over decades. Early explorers often described how rivers led them to fertile valleys or connected them to other waterways. Canoes slipped silently past massive roots of cypress knees in southern wetlands, while northern explorers navigated birch-lined streams that narrowed into hidden portages. Yet, the forest remained calm. A mighty oak watching a river bend did not concern itself with who paddled past. It simply observed, bending with the wind, waiting for the next century of travelers. Explorers, while following existing trails, inevitably altered the landscape. Boots compacted soil, axes felled small trees to make the way easier, and fires sometimes cleared brush. Yet, the forest adapted. Fallen leaves replaced compacted soil, seeds sprouted along disturbed edges, branches grew around obstructions. In some ways, every human interaction became part of the trail's story. A well-worn path was rarely permanent. Over decades, trails shifted. New travelers found slightly different routes, always guided by topography and water, and always under the watchful canopy of the old-growth forest. In time, even abandoned trails left traces in subtle ways. Moss-covered depressions, stones moved into linear patterns, small depressions indicating foot traffic. For those willing to see, the forest itself could reveal the history of movement across its floor. For the first explorers who penetrated these forests, travel was both perilous and awe-inspiring. Journals and letters frequently remark on the immense height of the trees, the endless sea of green, and the silence that pressed upon the mind. They were often guided by local indigenous people who could read the forest intuitively. Without that knowledge, many would have been hopelessly lost. For those who followed old animal paths and indigenous trails, the forest slowly revealed itself. Campfires glowed under towering canopies. Meals were shared in clearings found by following subtle earth patterns. Footprints of deer or bear, sometimes centuries old and fossilized impressions, hinted at which paths might be safest. Explorers gradually learned to move with patience, to respect the trees that had existed long before them, and to see the forest as a living guide rather than an obstacle. One of the quietest lessons the forest offered was about humility. In Europe, landscapes had been tamed and controlled. In America, the forest dominated. Every decision, every misstep could lead to danger. Yet, the forest also taught adaptability, observation, and respect for natural rhythms. A traveler learning to read the trees discovered patterns. Moss often grows on the north side of trees, hinting a direction. Fallen logs indicate past water flow or storms.
Branches angled by prevailing winds hint at long-term weather patterns. Animal trails can guide travelers to water or safe clearings. Through these subtle signs, early explorers learned to navigate without the compass, without roads, without a clear map. They became part of the forest's story, moving carefully, observing keenly, and leaving behind traces that would fade only slowly over generations. While explorers traversed these trails, the forest bore witness to countless narratives. Families fleeing conflict or searching for new land, traders transporting furs, hides, and goods, scientists recording plant species, hunters pursuing game for survival. Each person, unaware or aware of the forest's longevity, contributed a small story to the immense living archive. Even those who passed without noticing the forest's secrets still became part of its history. Every footprint, broken branch, and whispered word settled into the forest's memory, integrated into a living network of observation.
The trees, patient and silent, carried these stories in rings, scars, and root systems. They remembered what humans often forget, that every action leaves an imprint, no matter how subtle. Not all trails survived intact. As settlements grew and forests were cleared, many paths disappeared under plowed fields, roads, and towns. Some trails were abandoned and reclaimed by the forest entirely. Yet even these forgotten trails persist in subtle ways. Root patterns follow the original paths. Faint depressions in the earth remain. Plant species along old trails differ slightly from the surrounding forest. These remnants are a living archive. A natural historian or trained observer can read these old trails and understand centuries of movement, even when no human has walked there for decades. Thus, the forest itself becomes a guidebook written in wood, soil, and leaf. Today, hikers, scientists, and nature enthusiasts walk paths originally carved by animals and refined by human use. Some trails have been formalized in parks with signs and maps. Others remain wild, known only to those who pay close attention. Yet every modern step echoes centuries of movement before. When a hiker pauses beneath a towering pine, they are standing in the shadow of countless generations. Native hunters, colonial explorers, surveyors, early naturalists. The trail beneath their feet is layered with history. In this way, the forest itself continues its role as time traveler. It does not move, but it carries memory forward, linking past and present with every step taken beneath its canopy. The history of forgotten trails offers enduring lessons. 1. Patience and observation. The forest moves slowly. Observing patterns allows one to navigate successfully. 2. Respect for nature. Following rather than forcing a path minimizes harm and ensures longevity for both humans and forest. 3. Interconnectedness. Animal, human, and plant movements are deeply intertwined. Each trail represents countless lives and choices. 4. Memory and continuity. Even when human knowledge fades, the forest remembers. Trails may be invisible to the untrained eye, but they remain present in earth, roots, and trees. Ultimately, the forest itself is the most remarkable explorer. Trees do not move, yet they traverse time. They watch silently as humans navigate, learn, and make history. They stand as enduring witnesses to journeys we can barely imagine. Hunters silently moving at dawn, explorers camping in moonlight, families walking to distant villages, traders carrying goods across hidden pathways. Each generation adds to the story, but the forest remains constant. Every trail walked, forgotten, or remembered passes through its memory. And every visitor today continues to write history beneath the canopy. When we walk beneath these trees, we are not merely hiking or exploring. We are participating in centuries of movement and memory. We stand in shadows that have sheltered countless lives. We touch bark that has endured storms, droughts, and the passage of empires.
We follow trails that have guided deer, bison, and humans alike. And for a moment, we become part of the forest's quiet narrative. The ancient trees continue to watch. They do not judge, they do not forget. Every visitor adds a new layer to the living tapestry of life beneath the canopy. Every step honors the paths carved long ago and ensures that those trails, though forgotten by many, remain alive in memory. Forgotten trails remind us that history is not only found in books or monuments, it is found in living landscapes, in root systems and fallen leaves, in the subtle signs left behind by creatures long gone. Forests are more than collections of trees. They are archives, libraries, and time machines. They teach that movement matters, that observation matters, and that respect for the land ensures continuity across generations. By walking beneath the canopy, by following the trails, by pausing and noticing, we connect with explorers of the past, animals who shaped the land, and trees that have silently witnessed it all. The next time you enter an ancient forest, imagine the countless footsteps that came before yours. Imagine the explorers who marveled at towering oaks, the hunters guided by deer paths, the surveyors mapping lands they barely understood. Walk gently, listen carefully, and know that beneath your feet, the forest remembers. And if you pause long enough, you may feel it, the hum of history carried not in words, but in wood, leaf, and soil. You are walking among the timeless travelers, the trees, the trails, the memories, and you too become part of the story beneath the canopy. In the quiet heart of an old-growth forest, the wind whispers. It rustles through leaves, bends branches, and carries faint scents from tree to tree. It is subtle, almost imperceptible to humans in our rush of modern life, yet it is the language of the forest. Through the wind, the ancient trees converse, warn, nurture, and remind each other and the creatures beneath their canopy of the rhythms and dangers of life. To stand in such a forest is to enter a world where messages are not written in ink or sent through screens. They are woven into the air, traced in the motion of leaves, and carried in the vibrations of roots. The wind is both messenger and medium, an invisible teacher sharing lessons older than human memory. Even in a small grove, you can feel it. A sudden ripple of wind passes through the treetops. A leaf shivers, another bends slightly. To the untrained eye, it is only the wind moving. But in the forest, it is far more. A signal, a warning, a note of preparation. Trees are remarkably perceptive. They sense changes in humidity, temperature, and light. When one tree experiences stress, perhaps from drought, disease, or insect attack, it can release chemical signals into the air. These airborne compounds alert neighboring trees to prepare their defenses. Leaves may thicken, sap flow may intensify, or certain protective chemicals may develop. Early humans never understood this invisible conversation. Indigenous stories often described talking trees, spirits that warned or guided people. In truth, the trees were speaking in chemical and physical messages carried on the wind, a language of survival that predated human discovery.
While the wind conveys messages through the air, much communication in forests occurs beneath the soil. Roots intertwine, often with mycorrhizal fungi acting as intermediaries, forming a vast subterranean web scientists now call the Wood Wide Web. Through this underground network, trees share nutrients with one another. Sick or dying trees can signal their neighbors. Young saplings receive support from older, more established trees. Warning signals travel through roots faster than wind or storm ever could. An oak, under attack by leaf-eating insects, may trigger nearby maples to produce chemical defenses before the insects arrive. A dying cedar may release nutrients that neighboring seedlings absorb, giving them a better chance to survive.
In combination with airborne messages, the wind and root networks allow the forest to communicate across vast distances, a system that is both subtle and remarkably efficient. Scientists began to study these communications in the 20th century. Experiments showed that trees react to chemical cues from neighbors. Experiments with sound vibrations revealed that trees respond to mechanical vibrations in the air and soil. Observations confirmed that when one tree is stressed, its companions adjust in response. Yet the forest is not hasty. Its messages are deliberate, measured, almost meditative. Unlike the instantaneous communication humans rely on today, these signals unfold slowly. A warning may take hours or days to propagate through a grove, giving saplings time to prepare. A nutrient-sharing signal might persist for weeks, slowly nurturing a fragile seedling. It is an ancient, patient form of communication, a rhythm tuned to centuries rather than minutes. The wind does more than carry warnings, it carries stories. Every rustle of leaves tells a history of sun and rain, of storms endured, of seasons past. The sound of trembling aspen leaves might indicate a cold front. Pine needles vibrating in the breeze can release resins that protect the entire forest from pests. The movement of tall trees in coastal forests signals water and salt-laden air from distant shores. These subtle motions are a living record. To a sensitive observer, the wind is like a storytelling medium, soft, intricate, and ongoing. The trees speak in whispers, and the forest becomes a library of sound and movement. Communication in forests is not mere ornament, it is survival. Winds deliver life-saving messages. Before a storm, older trees may signal to saplings through vibration, preparing them to withstand strong gusts. Insect infestations trigger airborne chemicals that alert surrounding trees to strengthen defenses. Drying soil induces chemical signaling, helping other trees conserve water before they themselves are stressed. Even in the largest, oldest forests, these messages can traverse great distances. A storm hitting the mountains may cause chemical and vibrational signals to ripple through a valley, preparing trees hundreds of feet away. The forest acts as a community, each tree attuned to the needs of its neighbors, and each message carried on the wind is a gentle note of care. The wind also communicates with animals. Birds detect shifts in chemical signals that indicate food or predators. Insects sense subtle pheromones that guide or warn them. Even humans can perceive these messages in small ways. The scent of pine resins after a windstorm, the rustle of leaves signaling a change in weather. A forest is never silent. Its language is encoded in multiple channels: air, soil, roots, vibrations, and chemical exchanges. To stand quietly in such a place is to feel the forest speaking, not in words, but in rhythms, motions, and scents. The oldest trees exemplify the slow wisdom of forest communication. A 1,000-year-old sequoia in California, for instance, has endured countless storms, fires, and droughts. Its roots reach deep, its canopy stretches high, and its chemical signals ripple through the forest in measured patterns. This tree demonstrates the forest's approach to communication. Messages are gradual, never rushed. Signals are precise, targeted, and purposeful. Survival and community come before speed. Modern humans rush messages in emails, texts, or social media. Nature, in contrast, teaches that patience, observation, and subtlety can be more powerful than urgency. The changing seasons provide a natural framework for communication. In spring, winds carry pollen and chemical signals to guide reproduction. Summer breezes alert the forest to heat stress or drought conditions. Autumn gusts carry seeds and nutrients for the next generation. Winter winds signal dormancy and conservation, allowing trees to slow their metabolism and wait for renewal. Every season is a chapter in the forest's ongoing conversation. The wind is the storyteller, the trees are both author and audience, and every rustle of leaves is a word written in motion.
As humans began studying forests scientifically, they realized the complexity of these communications. Researchers documented how trembling leaves can indicate early frost risk, how chemical cues warn of insect invasions, how interconnected roots distribute water and nutrients, how trees respond to mechanical vibrations caused by wind. These discoveries reveal a truth long observed by indigenous peoples. The forest is alive in a way that humans often overlook. Its messages are gentle, subtle, and eternal, and they embody lessons about connection, resilience, and patience. For those willing to observe, the forest communicates continuously, offering guidance on survival, cooperation, and adaptability. Writers, poets, and naturalists have long recognized the voices carried by the wind. Thoreau, Emerson, and Muir described forests as speaking in rustles and murmurs. These descriptions are not metaphors, they are literal observations of how trees interact with the wind. A grove of pines creaking in a gentle breeze can signal drought or soil stress. Aspens, trembling in clusters, share vibrational messages that ripple across the floor fun. A sudden sigh through oaks may indicate high humidity or the approach of a storm. Humans have interpreted these signs for guidance, nourishment, and inspiration. The forest's language is accessible to anyone who slows down and listens. Wind is not only a messenger, it is a partner. Trees sway, bend, and release seeds in response to breezes. Wind distributes pollen and spores, helping reproduction. It carries scents that attract pollinators or deter pests. The forest and wind perform a continuous symbiotic dance, exchanging information across time and space. This partnership emphasizes a larger lesson. Communication in nature is not about dominance, but cooperation. Survival depends on listening, responding, and passing on knowledge, principles that humans can emulate.
Ancient forests have been delivering messages long before humans existed. They have survived ice ages, droughts, wildfires, and storms. Through it all, the wind has carried their communications. Seed dispersal for regeneration, chemical alerts for defense, vibrational warnings for survival, nutrient sharing through roots. When humans enter these forests today, they step into a centuries-old conversation. Every gust of wind is a whisper from a tree that may have sprouted centuries ago, carrying a history of resilience and interconnection. The trees are the original time travelers, sending messages that bridge centuries. The wind is their courier, quiet, reliable, and eternal. Standing in the forest, one realizes that communication does not require words or technology. Observing, listening, and responding can create understanding across species and generations. The lessons are clear. Patience, messages unfold slowly. Rushing can cause misinterpretation. Observation, subtle signals often carry the most important information. Connection, survival depends on the health of the community, not just the individual. Resilience, knowledge shared across generations, strengthens the system as a whole. Humans can learn from the wind and trees. By slowing down, noticing details, and respecting interconnected systems, we become part of the same communication network that has sustained forests for millennia. Next time you enter an old forest, close your eyes, feel the wind brushing your skin, listen to the rustle of leaves and the swaying of branches, smell the scents carried through the air, observe the subtle motions of trees and understory plants. You are not merely observing, you are listening to a conversation that has persisted for thousands of years. You are hearing messages in the wind, alerts, advice, and stories of survival. Even without understanding the chemical signals or vibrational patterns, you participate simply by being present. You are now part of the ongoing exchange, the timeless dialogue that has sustained life in the forest for centuries.
In the end, the wind's messages remind us that the world is alive in ways we often fail to perceive. Forests communicate patiently, deliberately, and subtly. They teach us to observe, listen, and respond with care. They demonstrate that survival is not just individual, but communal, and that even the quietest voices carry profound importance. Ancient trees, the wind, and the forest as a whole form a network that transcends generations. Their communication is calming, subtle, and eternal. By understanding it, we gain perspective not only on the natural world, but on our own place within it. Standing beneath the canopy, feeling the wind ripple through leaves, one realizes that the forest has been speaking long before humans arrived and will continue long after we are gone. In that wind, we hear the forest's voice, patient, wise, enduring, and eternal. There is a quiet sadness in the memory of lost forests. Unlike a fallen building or a vanished village, the absence of a forest is profound yet subtle. The trees that once shaped the sky, held the soil, and whispered through leaves are gone, but their presence lingers in whispers, journals, and the resilience of seeds that survived elsewhere. Throughout the United States, countless ancient trees and entire forests have disappeared over centuries. Some were felled for timber, others cleared for farmland, roads, or cities. Fires and storms claimed many more, while climate changes reshaped ecosystems. Yet even in their absence, these forests leave traces, fragments of memory, fragments of life, fragments of stories that continue to resonate. This is the story of those forests that faded, how they were lost, what they left behind, and how their legacy persists for those willing to remember. Long before European settlers arrived in North America, the landscape was a patchwork of forests, prairies, wetlands, and mountains. Forests covered vast swaths of the East Coast, the Great Lakes region, the Pacific Northwest, and the South. Towering oaks and pines dominated the eastern seaboard. Giant sequoias and redwoods flourished in the west. Cypress swamps thrived in the deep south. Mixed hardwoods and conifers stretched across river valleys and uplands. These forests were living communities. Every tree, shrub, moss, and mushroom contributed to a complex ecosystem. Birds nested in hollows. Wolves, bears, and deer navigated the understory. Streams carried nutrients, sustaining plants and animals alike. Indigenous nations lived in close harmony with these forests, shaping and maintaining them through controlled burns, selective harvesting, and spiritual stewardship. The trees were not only resources, they were relatives, teachers, and living archives of the land's history. With the arrival of European settlers in the 16th and 17th centuries, the first marks of forest loss began. Trees were cut for shelter, ships, and fuel. Land was cleared to plant crops and establish towns. The great oaks of the eastern seaboard were felled to build homes and fortifications. Pine forests were harvested to create masts for ships that crossed the Atlantic. Southern cypress swamps were drained for plantations. Settlers marveled at the size and age of the trees, often recording their observations in journals or letters. Yet admiration did not prevent destruction. Progress, as defined by human needs, often took precedence over preservation. Still, these early writings became vital records. Today, historians and ecologists rely on these descriptions to understand forests that no longer exist, their size, composition, and even the life that thrived beneath their canopy. By the 19th century, the pace of forest loss accelerated. The Industrial Revolution demanded vast quantities of wood and fuel. Railroads carved corridors through mountains and plains, consuming trees in their path. Farming expanded, replacing diverse ecosystems with fields of monoculture crops. In the Midwest, thousands of acres of hardwood forests vanished to make way for wheat and corn. In the Northeast, its oaks and maples were felled to supply homes and industries. In the Southeast, its swamps were drained, reducing biodiversity and altering water systems. Even as entire forests disappeared, fragments survived. Groves of old trees, protected valleys, or seeds preserved by natural dispersal. These remnants carried the genetic memory of what was lost, waiting for opportunity to grow again in safer places.
Not all forest loss was human-caused. Nature itself claimed portions of the landscape. Wildfires, both natural and accidental, consumed acres of forest in a single season. Hurricanes and ice storms felled trees along the Gulf Coast and eastern seaboard. Droughts weakened ancient trees, leaving them vulnerable to disease and pests. The wind and rain reshaped the land, creating new clearings while erasing old canopies. The forests that faded through natural causes left an echo in the landscape. Fertile soil, fallen timber, and new opportunities for seedlings to sprout. In some ways, the loss of older trees became a catalyst for renewal, even if the original forests never returned. Even as forests disappeared, life found ways to persist. Seeds carried by wind, water, and animals established new groves, sometimes miles from the original trees. Some seedlings sprouted in sheltered valleys or along riverbanks. Others lay dormant in soil until conditions allowed growth. The survival of these seeds ensured that traces of lost forests could endure. A young oak today may be the descendant of a giant felled centuries ago. A cluster of pines might descend from ancestors cleared during early settlement. In this way, the memory of vanished forests lives on, encoded in genetics and growth patterns. Through seeds, the past continues to shape the present. Even forests that appear newly planted may carry the legacy of centuries-old ecosystems in their roots. While seeds carry biological memory, human records preserve cultural and ecological memory. Early settlers, travelers, naturalists, and writers often described forests in journals and letters. The trees towered so high that their tops vanished in the mist, wrote a colonial settler. A naturalist in the 1800s noted, "Every step in this forest reveals a new wonder, moss-covered logs, streams teeming with life, and a quiet that penetrates the soul." Farmers documented the disappearance of oak groves and pine forests as land was cleared for crops. These writings provide invaluable windows into forests long gone. They help us understand the scale of loss, the richness of biodiversity, and the human impact on the landscape. Through words, the forests continue to speak long after the last tree fell. The fading of forests offers lessons in humility and reflection. Impermanence. Even the mightiest forests are not eternal without care. Interconnection. Human activity is inseparable from ecological outcomes. Memory. Nature and culture together preserve what is lost, whether through seeds, soil, or stories. And hope. Even when forests vanish, life finds ways to persist and regenerate. Acknowledging loss does not mean despair. It allows us to understand the fragility of ecosystems and the role humans play in protecting or endangering them. Across the U.S., examples abound. The eastern old-growth forests, once stretching from Maine to Georgia, these hardwood forests were decimated for timber and farmland. Only small patches remain in protected areas. The Midwestern prairies and oak savannas, hundreds of thousands of acres were converted to agricultural land, leaving remnants that hint at a once vast ecosystem. Southern swamps, cypress and tupelo trees were logged or drained for plantations, with only isolated groves surviving. Western redwoods and sequoias, logging in the 19th and early 20th centuries claimed countless giants, though conservation efforts preserved some remarkable survivors.
Each lost forest teaches us about resilience, human impact, and the importance of stewardship. Their fading is a reminder that without care, even monumental natural beauty can disappear. Despite loss, remnants of ancient forests persist. Old stumps, moss, and seed banks indicate past forests. Protected groves in national parks preserve fragments of pre-settlement ecosystems. Urban trees often descend from ancestral groves. These remnants allow scientists to study historical ecosystems and guide reforestation efforts. They also provide spiritual and cultural continuity, connecting us to landscapes that shaped human experience for centuries. In some places, new trees grow in memory of those lost. In others, species reintroduced from seed banks revive portions of vanished ecosystems. Even faded forests can offer new life if given protection and opportunity. Walking through areas where forests once stood evokes reflection. Fields of crops, suburbs, and highways often occupy land that was once dense, ancient forest. Yet the mind can reconstruct the presence of towering oaks, whispering pines, and the chorus of forest life. The loss is personal as well as ecological. Writers, poets, and naturalists have mourned these forests, describing the absence as a quiet wound on the landscape. Yet mourning also carries a call to action, a gentle urging to protect remaining forests, plant new trees, and maintain connections to what we still have. The fading of forests was not inevitable. Awareness, policy, and stewardship have helped preserve and restore what remains. National parks and protected areas safeguard old-growth groves. Reforestation projects aim to revive ecosystems destroyed by logging or farming. Conservation programs protect endangered species dependent on forest habitats. By learning from past mistakes, humans can honor the memory of lost forests, ensuring that future generations experience the same beauty, diversity, and wisdom that ancient trees provided. While trees themselves may be gone, their memory persists in literature, art, and oral history. Letters from settlers describe landscapes that no longer exist. Diaries of naturalists preserve observations of species and ecosystems. Indigenous stories recount the significance of groves, trails, and sacred trees. These accounts allow us to witness lost forests through human eyes, bridging centuries of absence. They remind us that forests are more than timber. They are archives, teachers, and companions. Nature also ensures continuity through seeds. Seeds carried by wind, water, and animals often escaped destruction. Seeds stored in seed banks today allow for reintroduction of species lost to deforestation. Young trees growing in urban parks, schools, or restored landscapes may be descendants of forests that vanished centuries ago. Through seeds, the legacy of ancient forests endures. Even in the absence of the old giants, life persists in small, patient, resilient forms. Reflecting on forests that have faded encourages a broader perspective. We recognize the impermanence of ecosystems. We appreciate the value of conservation before it becomes urgent. We see the interconnectedness of human action and ecological change. We understand that memory, both natural and cultural, is vital to preserving the wisdom of the past. The quiet absence of these forests speaks as loudly as their presence once did. In remembering them, we honor the silent witnesses, the seeds that survived, and the stories that endure.
What can humans learn from these ancient trees? Their longevity and endurance offer several insights. 1. Resilience. Life persists even under extreme conditions. 2. Patience. Growth may be slow, but each year adds to a foundation that spans centuries. 3. Interconnectedness. Trees support countless organisms, showing that survival is collective. 4. Wisdom in silence. The calm of old trees teaches observation, reflection, and respect for natural rhythms. By studying and observing these keepers, humans gain more than scientific knowledge.
They acquire lessons in how to live sustainably and harmoniously with the natural world. Even the oldest trees are not invincible. Despite their resilience, they face threats from human activity and environmental change. Deforestation and logging reduce the number of ancient trees and fragment habitats. Climate change affects temperature, water availability, and the prevalence of pests. Urban expansion can encroach on old-growth forests and delicate ecosystems. Pollution weakens the health of soil, water, and the trees themselves. The continued existence of these keepers depends on conservation efforts, education, and awareness. Protecting them is not merely preserving beauty, it is preserving living archives, ecosystems, and lessons for future generations. Ancient trees have long held cultural and spiritual importance. Indigenous peoples often regarded trees as elders, teachers, or sacred beings. Early European settlers sometimes wrote in awe of monumental trees, using them as landmarks and symbols of endurance. Modern visitors experience awe and reflection when standing beneath their canopies. These trees remind us that life is interconnected and that the past is carried into the present through living beings. Their presence evokes humility, gratitude, and wonder, a reminder that we are part of a continuum that stretches beyond our lifetimes. The keepers are also invaluable for science. Bristlecone pines, sequoias, and cypresses provide tree ring records revealing past climate conditions, including droughts, rainfall patterns, and fires. Genetic insights into resilience and adaptation across centuries. Habitat preservation for endangered species and ecological research. Studying these trees allows scientists to better understand ecological history, predict environmental change, and develop conservation strategies. In this sense, the keepers are both teachers and guardians, linking past, present, and future knowledge. People who encounter these ancient trees often describe profound experiences. A hiker beneath the bristlecone pines remarked, "I felt as if the mountain itself was breathing through the trees." Visitors to the angel oak describe a sensation of being held by centuries of life, of time stretching and folding in unexpected ways. Those who see the giant sequoias often speak of perspective, realizing that human life is brief, but that one can still make a meaningful impact in the time allotted. These experiences highlight the unique role that ancient trees play in human consciousness. They are living reminders of endurance, resilience, and the deep connections between life and environment. Preserving the oldest trees requires conscious effort. National parks protect many of the country's ancient forests, such as Yosemite, Sequoia, and Great Smoky Mountains. Conservation organizations work to protect endangered old-growth trees and promote sustainable forestry practices. Education helps people understand the importance of these trees and inspires stewardship. By protecting the keepers, we ensure that their lessons, calm, and wisdom remain available for future generations. Their survival is a reflection of both nature's resilience and humanity's responsibility. Across the continent, these ancient trees form a network of timekeepers. Each species and location adds a unique story. Bristlecone pines record millennia of climate extremes. Coastal redwoods preserve biodiversity and support countless organisms. Southern cypresses withstand floods, hurricanes, and environmental shifts. Together, they embody the natural history of America, linking distant landscapes and ecological narratives. Standing among them is to stand in a living library, each tree a volume of knowledge, each branch a paragraph, each leaf a sentence in a story that stretches beyond human memory. The presence of these keepers offers something intangible yet profound: calm. It is not simply the absence of noise, but a palpable sense of history, survival, and quiet wisdom. The air feels slower. The heart senses steadiness. Thoughts soften, allowing reflection on the scale of life, time, and persistence. This calm is a gift. In an era of constant motion and noise, encountering ancient trees allows humans to pause, reflect, and reconnect with deeper rhythms of life. From the keepers, we learn resilience is cultivated slowly. Survival requires adaptability and patience. Longevity is intertwined with community and ecosystem support. Silence can be a form of strength. Memory, encoded in rings, seeds, and roots, carries wisdom across generations. These lessons are not merely ecological, they are philosophical. Observing ancient trees encourage humans to consider how we live, act, and care for the world around us. To visit one of these ancient trees is to feel the continuity of life. A single bristlecone pine on a mountainside has endured civilizations, climate shifts, and countless storms. A giant sequoia in the Sierra Nevada shelters hundreds of species while silently recording centuries of sunlight, rain, and frost. A cypress in a southern swamp anchors a watery world that supports countless creatures. Each encounter inspires reverence, reflection, and awe. Visitors leave with more than photographs. They carry a sense of calm, perspective, and responsibility. The keepers remind us that life is resilient, interconnected, and enduring, but only if respected. The oldest trees of America are more than survivors. They are messengers from the past. They speak in rings, resin, bark, and roots. They teach patience, endurance, interconnectedness, and humility. They bear witness to centuries of life and human history. In standing before a tree that has survived millennia, one glimpses eternity. Visitors sense the weight of time, the calm of continuity, and the sacredness of life itself. The keepers who remain are the living memory of America's forests, and their message is clear: respect the past, protect the present, ensure the future. In their presence, the air remembers, the soil remembers, and for a fleeting moment, so do we.
The forest at night has its own rhythm, a soft, undulating pulse that only the most attentive can perceive. Darkness gathers gently, and the last light of the sun filters through the high canopy, painting leaves in muted gold and green. Shadows stretch like the fingers of centuries past, and the air smells of earth, bark, and quiet. Tonight, you are not merely walking through the forest, you are entering its heart, approaching one of the oldest living beings in North America, a tree that has stood for 4 millennia. Its roots reach deep into the soil, entangling with ancient fungi and the remnants of trees long fallen. Its trunk, gnarled and textured, carries the stories of millennia etched into every crevice. To rest at its base is to touch history, not written in ink, but in rings of growth, patterns of wither endured, and the invisible hum of life surrounding it. As night falls, the forest becomes a lullaby, the oldest tree a gentle storyteller, and you, a quiet listener, surrendering to the slow, comforting rhythm of nature. The journey to the ancient tree is deliberate, unhurried. Each step is cushioned by layers of fallen needles, moss, and soil, and each breath carries the cool, damp scent of pine and earth. Fireflies flicker like tiny lanterns, signaling the transition from day to night. Above, the sky darkens gradually, revealing stars that seem closer in this quiet, unlit place. The first breeze of evening flows through the branches, rustling the leaves and setting the forest's nighttime symphony in motion. The sounds are subtle: a distant owl, the faint call of a fox, the gentle clatter of leaves as small animals forage. Each sound, each movement is part of the conversation of the forest, and ahead, the massive silhouette of the 4,000-year-old tree waits, its presence at once awe-inspiring and soothing. The tree is not just a physical entity,
It is a bridge across time, a keeper of memories, and tonight, your companion. Approaching the trunk, you notice the way the bark curves and folds like the surface of an ancient manuscript. Moss carpets its lower regions, softening the impression of age and grounding the immense weight of centuries. You sit carefully against the base, feeling the subtle vibrations of life pulsing from the roots deep in the soil. Each breath of wind carries a hint of the forest beyond: pine, cedar, damp earth, and the distant freshness of mountain streams. The forest seems to acknowledge your presence. A subtle hush settles over the grove, as though the leaves themselves are leaning closer to listen. In this quiet, your own heartbeat begins to sync with the rhythm of the old tree. Time slows, measured not in minutes, but in deep, unhurried breaths. Looking upward, the tree's branches stretch wide and strong, some of them twisted with age, others reaching straight towards the stars. The leaves flutter gently, catching the moonlight in soft silver glimmers. The night sky beyond is vast, scattered with constellations that have watched over the tree for thousands of years. The forest canopy above is alive in its own way. Night creatures, owls, bats, and moths begin their silent movements, navigating the shadows with grace. Even the rustle of distant leaves carries a pattern, a quiet message that the forest is awake, attentive, and protective. Here, in this vast cathedral of living wood and night air, the scale of your worries diminishes. The oldest tree, older than recorded American history, reminds you that life persists patiently and beautifully across the sweep of time. The tree's presence is calming, almost meditative. Its trunk radiates a subtle warmth, not from heat, but from the energy of living wood that has survived storms, droughts, and centuries of change. Every knot, crack, and fold in its bark is a story, a record of resilience and endurance. As you lean against it, the forest hums a low, continuous note. Perhaps it is the collective movement of leaves, the soft vibration of roots connecting with fungi and soil, or the subtle breathing of the ecosystem itself. Regardless, the effect is immediate. Your mind eases, tension melts, and a sense of deep peace settles over you. In this presence, you realize that the tree has been here through every human generation, every storm, every season. Its quiet, enduring existence reminds you that patience, stillness, and observation are as vital as action and speed. Close your eyes. The wind begins to move through the branches, carrying stories. The tree's whispers are not in words, but in rhythm, vibration, and scent. Each rustle of leaves conveys memory. The year when a storm tore across the mountains, bending but not breaking the branches. A drought that tested every root and forced the tree to conserve life through the arid months. Generations of birds nesting safely among its branches. Seeds carried away by wind and animals, creating groves elsewhere. These stories are slow, drawn out over centuries. They do not demand attention. They reward quiet, reflective listening. As you breathe with the forest, you begin to feel these tales not just in your mind, but in your body. A subtle pulse that resonates in your chest, a rhythm that slows your heart and eases your mind. As the night deepens, the forest produces a symphony of sound. The soft patter of an unseen stream, the distant cry of an owl marking territory, leaves brushing against each other, carrying signals from branch to branch, the faint hum of insects starting their nightly activities. Even in silence, the forest communicates. The wind carries messages from tree to tree, from leaf to leaf, from root to root. It is a language older than humans, yet we can perceive its effect: calm, rhythm, and a sense of belonging. Here, surrounded by life that operates on timescales far greater than your own, you feel the expanse of patience and resilience. The oldest tree and you enter a quiet dialogue, It does not speak aloud, yet its presence conveys wisdom. Slow your thoughts. Feel your connection to the living world. Recognize the cycles of growth, change, and renewal. Understand that survival requires patience, adaptation, and cooperation. Your heartbeat slows, your breath lengthens. The hum of the forest and the pulse of the tree create a rhythm that is both personal and universal. You are part of a continuum that has persisted for thousands of years, and for this night, the forest welcomes you. Imagine placing your hand against the tree's trunk. You feel texture, temperature, and the rough contours of age. Beneath the surface, rings tell stories of centuries. Years of abundant rainfall, growth, and strength. Years of drought, cold, or fire that tested resilience. Decades of wildlife nesting in its branches. Centuries of wind brushing leaves, carrying messages across the forest. Each ring, each fissure, each knot is a lesson in endurance. By touching it, you connect with the wisdom of millennia, a tactile bridge between the fleeting nature of human life and the slow, deliberate persistence of nature.
Looking up, stars pierce the darkness, framed by the tree's branches. Some of these stars may have shone over the forest for thousands of years, constant witnesses to its life. The moonlight filters through leaves, creating patterns that shift and shimmer. In this gentle light, the forest seems to breathe. The oldest tree exudes a calm presence, and the air itself feels heavier with history and lighter with peace. Night animals continue their work quietly, their activities part of a timeless rhythm that humans rarely perceive. The juxtaposition of eternity in your brief existence is comforting rather than daunting. You are a guest, observing life that stretches far beyond human measurement, and in this observation, you find solace. The forest's lullaby continues. Your eyelids grow heavy as you sit at the base of the ancient tree. The wind's movement through the branches forms a soft, rhythmic hum, like a heartbeat that is larger, slower, and steadier than your own. Each rustle of leaves becomes a gentle stroke, soothing and rhythmic. The scent of pine, moss, and damp earth grounds you in the present moment. The quiet chorus of nocturnal life becomes a lullaby, a slow narrative woven from centuries of forest memory. As your breathing synchronizes with the pulse of the forest, your body relaxes, your thoughts soften, and sleep begins to arrive. Not abruptly, but gradually, as if guided by the tree's own centuries-long rhythm. As you drift, the wind carries fragments of stories into your dreams. The towering bristlecone pines of the mountains stretching skyward through snow and sun. The cypress swamps of the southeast, home to creatures that rely on their centuries-old roots. The quiet growth of seeds that escaped storms and human hands, sprouting in distant, safe places. Your mind wanders through these ancient forests, each dream a gentle echo of the night's reality. Even asleep, you remain connected to the pulse of life, the wisdom of endurance, and the calm of ancient guardians. Before sleep fully takes over, the forest deepens its stillness. Even the wind softens, carrying only the faintest hum. The ancient tree stands firm, a sentinel through time, witnessing the passing of human generations and the unfolding of natural rhythms. In this calm, the night feels sacred. You understand that the tree's story is not only of survival, but of patience, observation, and quiet influence. Its presence is a gift, a reminder that life continues in its own rhythm, with its own wisdom, and that you are a part of that continuum. Though the night is long and sleep deep, you awaken in the forest, still leaning against the ancient tree. The morning light begins to filter through leaves, painting the grove in warm gold and soft green. Birds stir, insects hum, and the forest awakens to another day. Even in awakening, the calm remains.
The memory of the tree's rhythm, the forest's lullaby, and the wind's whispered stories lingers, infusing the start of your day with perspective, patience, and reverence. Sitting beneath a 4,000-year-old tree teaches more than relaxation. It fosters connection to the forest and its life, present and past, to the cycles of nature that span millennia, to your own place within a larger rhythm of existence, to the continuity of time, patience, and resilience. For one night, you are not merely a human in the forest, you are a participant in a conversation that has existed long before you arrived and will continue long after you are gone. This connection, subtle and profound, is a gift, a reminder that nature's wisdom is eternal, accessible to anyone willing to pause, observe, and listen. As the night fully embraces you, the ancient tree's presence becomes a final lullaby, slow, steady, and enduring. Its roots anchor the land, its branches carry the wind and messages across the forest, its rings hold centuries of sun, rain, and wind. Its calm invites sleep, reflection, and renewal. Tonight, you rest beneath a tree older than any written history in America, part of a continuum that stretches through millennia. The forest hums softly, and the wind whispers a slow, calming story only the quiet of night can understand. You drift fully into sleep, comforted by the rhythm of the forest, the wisdom of the ancient tree, and the eternal presence of life that persists, patiently and beautifully, across time. And in this gentle night, the oldest tree and the forest embrace you in their quiet, enduring lullaby, a gift of calm that remains long after dreams fade.